Welcome to Real Rockford Files, for tales of the paranormal, supernatural, and the flat-out unbelievable. Today I'll be sharing ghost stories and hauntings. Let's get into it. Story 1. With a story like this, where exactly do I start? I have always held an interest in the paranormal, and this one evening in St. Augustine, I decided I would attempt to perform a paranormal investigation and get my toes wet, and see what it is all about. After all, what was the worst that could happen, right? Well, I went ahead and signed up and listened to the leader initially tell us about the tools that we would be using and explaining what type of activities other people have experienced, and was led inside the old jail and shown some photographs that people have caught on location, and was told some key phrases that others have noticed would bring out a reaction from the spirits. And armed with that knowledge, I went ahead and grabbed some equipment and went out into the old jail to see what was hiding in the shadows for me to locate. Now, I did have a spirit box, and I had been warned about the crawler, and decided that the first location I would go to check out would be the location of solitary confinement. Mostly because in the back of my mind, my thoughts are that if there was something holding a lot of energy in it, it should be down there, where people were held by themselves, and also that happened to be the location where the death row was, as prisoners waited to go to the gallows. Makes perfect sense that there would be some energy there, right? I definitely was in for a treat down there, to be perfectly honest. As I was recording and running my spirit box, I happened to notice that spirit orbs started to frequently fly by me, especially once the name of the sheriff that ran the jail was mentioned. However, to my disappointment, not much was coming through the spirit box, so maybe I wasn't asking the right questions. However, I did capture on camera the sounds of feet shuffling that I had heard with my own ears, and later on, when reviewing footage, heard a growl off to the side of the camera. To be fair, I never felt quite alone in this location, as I always felt like someone was watching me, or standing next to me. All that led down to one burning question in my mind as I left that location that night. What secrets are hiding in those walls, and what sort of evidence can I find if I return one day and reinvestigate? More updates to come. Story 2. Recently, I was asked by a friend if I had any ghost stories. I had forgotten about this experience and thought since it's close to Halloween, I would relay it here. About a decade ago, I was away with two friends for a girls' weekend at the beach. A family member owns a condo there and had kindly agreed to let us use it for a few days. One of the nights there, we were sitting in the living room, drinking wine and talking about events from our childhood. We had been out early in the evening and were winding down the day after hitting the beach and a few bars. Myself and a girlfriend, Amy, decided to play a joke on my other friend, Susan. Off the main living room was a half bathroom. Susan was sitting in a chair with her back to the bathroom. One of us would get up to walk into the kitchen and would turn the water on in the bathroom, then sit back down. Yes, I admit it, we were terrible for doing this. Each time Susan would hear the water running, she would get up from her chair and question us about it. We denied knowing how the water had mysteriously gotten turned on. At one point I said out loud, "If there is a ghost in here, move that lamp." There was a floor lamp located next to the sofa in the living room. After a few times of us pulling this prank, Susan got up, got her shoes on, and was going to leave. We finally told her it was us messing with her. I felt horrible because she was clearly scared. After apologizing profusely to Susan, the three of us went into the kitchen to get some wine. The kitchen is fairly small, but it has a cutout that allows you to look into the living room area. As I was apologizing to Susan, who had her back to the living room, I hugged her. As I faced the living room, something caught my eye. The lamp, I get chills just typing this, that I asked to be moved if there was a ghost in here, was now rocking back and forth by itself. Now the only one somewhat scared was me. I had received my just desserts. As we still had a few days left to our vacation, I did not mention it to either of my friends. I waited until we left and were traveling back to Tampa before I brought that up. I was clearly the one that noticed the lamp moving. Thankfully, Susan has long since forgiven me, but I will never mess around like that again. Lesson learned. Story 3. This encounter was told to me by my sister, Anna. She had a friend named Julie that confided in her that strange things were happening in her home. Julie and her husband had moved in 1 year before. They had 2 children, Miles, who was 5, and Sean, who just turned 1. Julie said that she and her husband were hearing noises at night. At first they ignored it, putting it off to the house being old, but then things quickly got worse. The noises happened more often, things flew off tables, and Miles began having night terrors. Julie wanted to get someone to come in and figure out what was going on, but the husband refused, didn't believe in things like that. Not knowing what to do, she waited it out. 2 weeks later, Julie was home alone. The kids were in bed, and her husband had to work until 1 a.m. Too scared to be alone, she asked my sister, Anna, to stay with her. My sister noticed that Julie was close to tears and asked her if she was all right. She shook her head no. She said Miles would sometimes stare at nothing, that he was too scared to go into the kitchen where most of the activity was, and he would stand outside Sean's room at night. When she asked Miles why he was standing in his baby brother's doorway, he said he was protecting Sean from the bad man. When she asked what bad man, he said the one who throws things. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She asked him, "Do you see the bad man?" He nodded his head and pointed at the corner in the hall. She went pale. I didn't know what to do, so I turned Miles around and put him back to bed. My sister asked Julie when that happened. She said last night. Both women heard noises for hours, and my sister's water bottle flew off the table twice. My sister said it gave her the creeps. It was 1:30 when Julie's husband came home. She went to check on the kids as my sister gathered her things to leave. Both my sister and Julie's husband heard a scream. Both of them ran to find Julie standing in the doorway to Sean's room. They all were looking at something that was hovering near the baby. It seemed to float back and forth in front of the crib. Then it looked at them and disappeared. Julie's husband quickly grabbed the baby, and the family left for the night. Julie's husband finally let someone in to find out what was going on. They were told that the poltergeist in the kitchen was someone who had died there at least 30 years ago. He was an old man that was named John. He was angry, and in life as well as death was not a nice man. They also said the woman they saw in the baby's room was protecting the baby from the other spirit. She was no danger to them. As to who she was, they could not say, just that she meant no harm. My sister asked about Miles seeing this man. They told them sometimes young children can see spirits. The family moved 3 months after that. Story 4. So I had posted a story here recently, and I had another more recent one come up into my thoughts. My family seems to be sensitive to the paranormal/spiritual. I cannot say that we all believe, but we have all had some kind of odd occurrence happen to us. The original super sensitive person was my grandmother. She had more stories than I could remember. I will be telling one particular story which happened some time before she passed away. My closest cousin that I talked to every day was actually a witness to these events, as were a couple of other cousins to which I contact directly and have known my whole life. My grandmother was diagnosed with lupus, which runs in our family. This was around 2010, and the lupus was pretty advanced, because at the time, my grandmother was in another country and hadn't been able to get a clear answer of the disease she had. Once she came back to the U.S., it had advanced so far that she went into intense care and pretty intense medicine. This weakened her so much that she was bedridden for all of her last days. The family decided to keep her in the hospital for a few months, but once we saw she had no chance, we decided to care for her at home until the end. During her stay at the hospital is when the weird goings-on really got our attention, and they continued on into everybody's homes that she stayed in, as we all took turns caring for her. Those are some later stories. In the hospital, the nurses would be checking on my grandmother all night and day with various tests and administering various medicines. The problem was that she spoke no English, so my family members would take turns staying the nights with her when there was no translators around. The first to stay was my cousin D. He said the hospital looked creepy as it was at night. They would dim most of the hallway lights, and it would get very cold in there, and there was no space in the room, so you had to sit in a small waiting area outside of her room. From this particular sitting area, you had a clear view of my grandmother's room, and they would leave the door open so that we could keep watch on her in case she, as mentioned above, needed something and couldn't speak English. On this night, Dee said he felt uneasy because my grandmother kept moving as if she was in pain or uncomfortable, but when he'd go over to check on her, she was sound asleep. So he put it off as tossing and turning in her sleep. This sounded like a plausible explanation until she also started sitting up and talking at random, waking up as the night grew later. Dee would go over and ask if she was okay to check if she was actually awake and not having some kind of episodes. She clearly turned to look at him, wide awake, and said she was okay, but just talking to the lady that had been visiting more often than usual. Of course, my cousin Dee gets freaked out and tried to brush it off and helped her lay down and go back outside of the waiting area. To give a bit of perspective, the hallway was narrow, and it led to a single elevator that took you down to the lobby. They were on the 6th floor. The hallway was offline with the long 2x4 light fixtures. Dee said that around 1 to 2 a.m., random light fixtures would flicker on and off in a pattern and it randomly got ice cold. Dee was totally freaked out and just sat in shock. Dee said he looked over to see if he needed to get up to place a cover over Grandma because it was so cold. When he looked over, my grandma was sitting up in her bed and talking in a worried voice to a corner in the room, which you couldn't see from where he was sitting in the waiting area, since the door did not open all the way. He got some courage and stood up to see what was going on. Once he walked over, my grandma stopped talking, but looked very worried and was breathing pretty hard. He looked into the corner she was talking to, and it was empty. He turned back to my grandmother in disbelief and asked if she was okay, to see if she's actually awake and responding. As I said, we thought she was having little episodes of sleep talking and moving. She then grabs his hand and points to the corner behind him and tells him not to worry because she's gone, and she told her she can stay longer to say goodbye. Obviously, my cousin Dee takes his hand back and moves away from the corner of the room. Dee then asks my grandmother what she's talking about. My grandmother then said that a tall woman with pale skin and big black eyes that had no pupils, just all black, had appeared in front of her in the corner of the room. She said she had a long white dress and that would hang to the floor, but you could not see her feet. You don't know if she was floating. She also mentioned that she was holding a long spear-like item in one of her hands and a book in the other. My grandmother said the book looked like it was very old and it was only black, no letters or title. This being told my grandmother in Spanish that she was there to take her away and that it was her time, but she let my grandmother stay because she begged to say goodbye to everyone while they were all present. She had 10 children, including all their children. Dee then tells me he couldn't tell what my grandmother was saying, but after she explained what she did remember, he pieced together something she said, which roughly translates to, "Please don't take me, I'm not ready yet, please not yet." This was all he can piece together from the actual conversation my grandmother tried to explain. He only understood most of the Spanish, he could not speak or write it. Once Dee got her back down and sleeping, he sat down and called for another cousin Jay, to come join as he was too scared to be alone. As Jay and Dee stayed the rest of the night, the lights kept flickering and they kept getting cold gusts of air at random throughout the night. On that same night, they both saw her get up again into the same corner, point and say in an angry voice, "I told you to go away, I'm not coming yet." Since that moment, she never mentioned it again, and my cousins proceeded to tell our whole family this, who tried to deny it, although they experienced far worse growing up at my grandmother's house, which was insanely active with the paranormal. What confuses me is, isn't the Grim Reaper always described as a male with a skeletal face and limbs? This entity was a woman and looked very, very much alive. Story 5. I have some concerns, but to understand I should start at the beginning. When I was about 3 or 4 years old, my grandmother was messing around with a Ouija board around me. At one point there was a knock on the door, and when grandmother checked outside, nobody was there. I told her, "There's someone. It's a man, he wants you to let him in." My grandmother said no, quickly shutting and locking the door. The house suddenly felt like there was an earthquake. She took the Ouija board and burned it. I then started becoming sensitive to people's emotions and places to deep emotions. History. This happened in Dallas, Texas in 1994. Fast forward to age 9, I was taken in by my other grandparents. Parents were divorced and not taking proper care of me and my younger sister. I was in my room, very upset as I didn't like the way everyone was treating me. A black mass in the shape of a dog of some sorts appeared. It told me it was my friend, my strength, and the only thing I had to do was let it be part of me. Well, kid me just assumed I had made an imaginary friend, so I agreed. I continually saw an unknown figure throughout the house. That was between 1998 and 2008 in Marietta, Georgia. Since then, I've had a strong connection with spirits and places, like I had become a magnet, but only one is really strong and has been attached to me. My exes and now husband have all claimed to see him in sort of a way. 2008 to 2009. First ex swore one time he saw a man of red hugging me and it caused my eyes to turn red themselves. 2009 to 2011. The second ex swore he saw the man of red several times in the house and he always seemed angry towards him. 2014, my now husband has dreamed of him, saying the man was standing outside of the house looking at him angrily. I never spoke of the man to any of them until they mentioned the encounters. There are times I don't quite feel like myself, like I'm in a trance or in a dream. I've been told I talk in a strange and different voice in my sleep. I had many strange and vivid dreams, especially after having my first child. The spirit doesn't seem interested in the children, but to my partners. Can anyone give me any advice or suggestions? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed. Story 1. My cousins came over 3 years ago from Iowa to visit us and decided to tell us about a story when they caught a ghost on camera and some dog statues that moved on their own. They said they got them from a yard sale or a flea market. I forget, but the original owners of them didn't want them anymore, so they started to sell them because something terrified them so bad. I have been to his house and seen his dog statues, and I always felt some odd bad vibe and energy about them. Even my siblings felt it too while they were around them. I sometimes felt like they stared at me, and even everyone agreed. One of my cousins said that one of them creeped her out because she swears one moved his head to look at her and then back to normal. Then one day my aunt actually caught one moving whenever she looked away and back. She decided to throw them away in a plastic bag, and when my cousin asked what was in the bag, she was like, "Don't touch them, it's the dog statues. I'm throwing them out now since they scare me and give off a bad vibe." They also said that they heard barks and growls at night when they had them. I felt really spooked when they told me that, like those statues were definitely possessed either by a dog or a demon or a ghost that is attached to them, but they're gone now. Those statues really looked realistic. Story 2. Around the year 2010, a friend of mine called me asking if I would be interested in house sitting and watching his 2 cats as well for about a month as he was going into the hospital for medical treatments. I accepted immediately. When I first entered his place, I felt a heaviness but kept that silent. He gave me a tour of the place. I refused the basement and his bedroom. Both had a horrible sense to me. After he left, I proceeded to work on a list of things I wanted to help him out with in his home. Later on, I worked on settling a bit in the spare room he had for me to stay in. One day, as I was organizing some of my things in the spare room, both the cats came bolting in by me and hid under the bed. I knew they got wound up, but that was fear. So I looked up towards the living room where they had run, and there walking across the floor in the sun's rays from the window was a pair of man's legs. Just the legs. They had mechanics pants on, plus old boots. They walked slowly towards the front door. I didn't leave the room for a while. Now, I'm not afraid of ghosts or spirits, but this one had a very uneasy feel to him. I'm guessing this may be what I sensed from the start. After my friend returned from the hospital, we sat and chatted about what happened, which brought up the basement in his bedroom. He himself was very hesitant to go into the basement. As for his room, he indicated that when he moved in there were strange writings all over the walls, which he painted over. I sure wish he'd taken pictures. Story 3. This experience dates back 20 years ago to when I was only 8 years old. Still, I can remember it better than I remember the hike I took with my dog yesterday. First, to help paint a mental picture, this occurred on an old farm in Iowa, just outside of Sioux Center. If anyone knows where that is, my older brother and I had gone over to spend the night at a friend's farm. They have 4 kids in total. One brother my age, one brother my brother's age, one younger sister, and another older brother that wasn't at the house often. Specifically, he wasn't at the house this night. Fast forward to the nighttime. My friend and I had gone upstairs, and my brother and his friends stayed downstairs in the living room with sleeping bags. The sister and their parents in their own rooms on the main level of the house as well. It was almost 1 a.m. My friend and I still hadn't gone to sleep. We were just staying up late talking, being kids. Then things got creepy really fast. We both stopped talking and started listening into the hallway at the same time. Someone was pacing up and down the hallway with some very heavy footsteps. We were kids and I'd never experienced anything supernatural at the time, so that thought never crossed my mind. I asked my friend if it could be his oldest brother for any reason. He assured me he wasn't home, so I sat by the door and waited until the footsteps were walking away from our room. I creaked the door open to see nothing in the hallway. The footsteps also stopped. We were both understandably spooked, but I wasn't happy with just closing the door and calling it a night. Even though there was no way someone could have hidden time for me to not see them, I had to be sure, so I convinced my friend to go check it out with me. We left the room and down the hall toward where we last heard the footsteps going. There were maybe 5 steps down until the staircase took a 90-degree turn to the main floor. As you went down the first few steps, there was a window facing you. Most farms and acreages have one main yard light, and theirs was throwing enough light through this window to be able to see our way down the steps. Of course, I had to go first. Even though my friend was a good-sized farm boy and I was skin and bones, we crept down the stairs slowly and quietly, having no idea what we were in for. As soon as my foot touched the last step, something significantly taller than me ran right in front of us, knocking me back into my friend up on the stairs. Its footsteps were loud, like it was at a dead sprint. Even though it was only inches from us, neither one of us saw anything. It came from the left and ran to our right. The only thing to our left was the living room, where my brother and his friends were sleeping. Whatever it was standing over top of them while they slept. My buddy had enough. He ran back upstairs to his room. I wanted one last look before I followed him. I grabbed the hand railing and leaned out to let my eyes adjust to the dark a bit more. I saw my brother and his friends sleeping in their sleeping bags to my left, and when I looked to my right where the thing ran off to, I saw something else in the yard. Through the windows I could see a man walking. He was walking underneath the main yard light so I could see him clearly. He had tattered clothes on, a baseball cap, and a big sack slung over his shoulder that was full of whatever your imagination can think of. Other than the fact that it was 1 a.m, this man seemed strange because his clothes, skin, and even the bag over his shoulder were all a glowing gray color. That's when I decided I'd seen enough and ran back to my friend's room. First thing I did was look out his window, which faced the same direction that I'd seen this man outside. He was in the middle of the most open part of their yard when I saw him downstairs. However, from the upstairs window, there was no one outside. This homeless-looking man with a giant sack over his shoulder either set a sprinting record across the yard to hide, or simply vanished underneath the yard light. I've since experienced my fair share of paranormal events, sometimes going out looking for him, but I'll never forget the first encounter I had out at that farmhouse. Story 4. I have a lot of encounters from ghosts, but this one was a little different. Different because I'm not sure what exactly was encountered, but I'm hoping maybe someone can read this and shed a little light on this experience. So this was when I was probably about 17. I was hanging out with my boyfriend at the time and one of his friends. Now, one thing to put out there is that his friend was a pretty outdoorsy kind of guy. He wasn't scared of much. He grew up hunting and was always out exploring the woods at all hours. Living in a small town with a lot of parks and surrounded by wooded areas, there wasn't a lot to do, so exploring the woods was a typical thing for really any of us to do. I never used to be afraid of the woods until after this experience. This particular night, his friend decided that he wanted to go spotlight hunting. Yes, illegal, but we were kids and had no idea. We drove out to an area on a gravel road in my boyfriend's car. There used to be a bridge that went across the river, but it was burnt and eventually torn down, so it was closed off, and the end of the gravel had become overgrown with grass, weeds, and such. There's a tall bridge on the distance. Actually, it's a bridge our little town is very well known for, as it has a lot of history. We were out there miles away from town and from any houses. We found a place to pull over near the end of the gravel, and my boyfriend and his friend grabbed the rifle out of the trunk and their flashlight. Me being an animal lover, I didn't feel like taking part, so I chose to stay in the car. Before my boyfriend took off into the field, he told me to give them 15 minutes, and if they didn't come back, I could take his car and leave them. With that, they disappeared into the dark. So there I was, sitting in his car. There was a metal railing in front of the car that we had pulled up to, which the guys had to climb over. On both sides of the car there was tall grass, taller than the car. It was a bit spooky, but I tried to keep my mind busy. I turned the radio on and waited. 15 minutes went by, and they still weren't back. I hadn't heard any gunshots, so I figured maybe they just weren't having any luck. Then I get this weird feeling, the feeling of being watched, enough to make the hairs on your neck stand up. I tried to play it off as my nerves. I look out my window to the right, and I see the tall grass moving. I told myself it was the wind. I look out the driver's side window. The grass over there stood still. I've seen enough horror movies to know that I didn't want to look out the right window again. Ignorance is bliss, right? I look down at my phone and do everything I can to not look up, scared I might see something I didn't want to see. Then something hit the back of the car, pretty hard. I looked back, but with the tint and the darkness, it was impossible to see anything. So I checked the locks to make sure I was safe and turned up the radio. The knocking on the trunk and back window continued on and off. At this point, it had been an hour since they left, and I was hoping it was just them trying to play a joke on me. I knew I couldn't leave them out there, and there was no way I was getting out of the car. So there I sat, trying to ignore whatever was out there. The knock soon turned to shaking the car. I shrank down in my seat and just kept my eyes on my phone, waiting for the guys to get back. After about 15 minutes, the banging stopped and I was left in silence for about another 15 minutes when I hear the guys yelling. I sat up, flipped on the headlights to see my boyfriend, who had never touched a gun in his life, running towards the car, cradling the rifle in his arms, and vaulting over the metal railing. His friend came running soon after. I unlocked the doors and my boyfriend jumped in the driver's seat, throwing the gun in the back seat where his friend was scrambling to get in, yelling, "Go, go, go!" He quickly backed out and off we sped down the gravel road. My boyfriend's face was filled with terror and he starts yelling at his friend, "What the hell was that, man?" His friend is looking out the back windows, terrified, and exclaims, "It's following us." I was both scared and confused. I kept asking them what they were talking about and what happened, but they were too busy trying to calm down. We sped as fast as his car could go back towards town. Once it was clear we were safe, I asked again what happened, only to be told they didn't want to talk about it. Whatever it was, it had scared them more than I'd ever seen someone scared before. We eventually get back into town and pull up to his friend's house. We all sat there in silence for a minute. Both guys looked almost paralyzed, trying to figure out what they had seen. His friend finally spoke, admitting that after whatever they encountered, he was scared to even be home alone. Reluctantly, he got out of the car, grabbed his rifle, and headed inside. I questioned my boyfriend for the next several days, but he always got a weird look on his face and shook his head like he didn't believe it himself. It was apparent I would never know, and I guess a part of me was okay with that, so I stopped asking, and life went on. Okay, so now 9 years later, and I finally got the answer. Like most high school relationships, my boyfriend from back then had been broken up for a long time, and I'm actually married now with 2 kids, and 1 on the way. Well, it just so happens that my husband had this guy start working with him at work. It took a couple weeks and on-the-job stories from my husband to realize that this guy was the friend of my boyfriend all those years ago. I decided to open up to my husband and tell him about this horrifying experience we all had back then. Well, my husband is a big fan of a podcast called Dogman Encounters. He told me that a lot of the guests on the show had similar experiences that I did while I was in that car, that they would hear banging on the car and it would shake almost like it was trying to lure them out. I suggested that maybe text the guy that he worked with, the friend of my ex, and ask him about that night. He did, and the response was not what I was expecting. He got a reply, the guy explaining how that night haunts him. He told about how they were out in the field, not having much luck. They heard a whole bunch of birds in the grass suddenly take flight, making a ruckus, and gave the guys a bit of a jump. They went over to the area with the flashlight on, and that's when they saw him. He said he was unusually tall and very skinny and lanky, as well as very pale. It was odd enough to see anyone out there at the time of night, let alone being out in a large field lined with forest. He just didn't belong. He then went on to say that the weirdest thing about this guy was his voice. It was very abnormal and unexpectedly high-pitched, like a child. What did the guy say? Well, this is the part that still sends shivers down my spine. Apparently, he said, "You might want to check on that girl you left back in that car." This friend described how they ran back through the field, across the ditch, and back to the car. He said they were running as fast as they could, and this guy was running parallel with them, but through the wooded area, a much harder route, and yet he was keeping perfect pace with them. The trees and terrain didn't slow him at all as they all sprinted back to me in the car. That's when we had started speeding back home. He said when he looked back, he saw the guys step over the metal barrier next to the road. They had to vault to climb over it, but this guy stepped over it like it was nothing. So here I am. My story is finally concluded after 9 years. Although I've tried researching similar encounters, I can't find anything. The only thing I know for sure is whatever that was, it wasn't human. I don't know if it was a ghost, a mystery of nature, or what. So I guess that I'm here for is to find out if anyone has heard or had any personal experience with something like this. I'm terrified to go back to that place, even in the daylight. Any ideas would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed. Story 1. It happened a few months back or so, I can't remember exactly. I went to bed later than usual that night. I fell asleep just fine. I had my fan going and my lamp on. I forgot to turn it off that night. Nope, my fan was placed at the end of my bed, and it was on high as it can go. I was sleeping when I noticed that my surroundings became aware to me. I did not open my eyes. I was afraid to, and I just knew I would see something that would frighten me. Not long after, my body became warm and tingly. At this point, I was not afraid. The longer I lay there wondering what was going on, I felt the movement of my body stop. The warm, not so scary feeling was gone, and I could no longer move. Right away it seemed dark and my fan tunneled out. Nothing but still silence. I'm shaking and sweating, still have not opened my eyes. I had this weird feeling, and right then I felt a face hover right above mine. It was still complete silence in my room. The air felt thick. It was almost like I heard the lips break apart before speaking. That is when I hear a deep, angry old man's voice say, "I hate you, I will hurt you." I wanted to scream, but my mouth does not budge. I wanted to get up and run, but I could not move my body. All I could do at this point was think, go away, leave me alone." I started praying, anything to get out of this situation. All at once, everything lifted. I no longer felt a man hovering above my head. My fan tunneled back in and I could see light through my shut eyes. I waited a couple of minutes before moving or opening my eyes. Once I did, I turned on my TV, calmed down, and went to bed a couple hours later. It doesn't end there. In the morning, I told my dad. He just looked shocked and told me how he had nightmares about a man's face floating around that exact night. He told me how he woke up covered in sweat. Story 2. First off, I want to say I do enjoy paranormal websites and sharing all the stories that I find on them. It's great to know I'm not alone. I've had many experiences throughout my life that could be categorized as paranormal in my opinion. The most terrifying one was about 8 years ago. I had never had an experience like it since. My husband, myself, our son and daughter recently moved into his deceased father's home. This is in a rural farming town, and the home we had was even further into the country, as we called it. We lived on a gravel road. Our closest neighbor was a mile away. Everything was going pretty good. The kids' room was upstairs and ours was downstairs. My husband worked and I was a stay-at-home mom at the time. The kids rode the bus to school and I was at home for half a day by myself. I would hear footsteps but always figured it was my deceased father-in-law. We had hardwood floors and it always sounded like heavy boots were walking around upstairs. Shortly after moving in, my daughter, who was 4 at the time, said she had made a new friend. She said her friend's name to me, I can't remember the name, it was like Madeline or Marjorie, and it was a very old-fashioned name for a young girl. She said her new friend lived in our pasture by the pond. She said her friend was a little girl just like her. She said her friend had brown hair and wore a dress that she would come visit her in her room and play. They played dolls. This went on for about a month. My daughter talked about her like she was one of her friends from preschool. I just thought it was an imaginary friend. My son never spoke of his friends like this. He was 6 at the time. One day my daughter was upset, worried about her new friend. She told me that her friend and her parents had been camping by our pond, and one day her parents just left her. She said that her friend was alone and had been alone a long time. We never had any camp on our property. The pond could be seen from our back door. No one was ever there or could even get to it without driving past our house and through our yard. Not to mention we raised English Mastiffs, so nothing got past them without us knowing. It kind of freaked me out, so I would try and change the subject when she would mention her friend. Then one night, the kids were upstairs asleep in their beds, and my husband and I were in our room asleep. All of a sudden, I woke up. I could feel eyes on me. I knew someone was in the house. I couldn't hear anything. I could just feel it. I sat up in bed trying to be extra quiet to just listen to the house. Nothing, not even the sound of ticking clocks. An eerie silence. I laid back down thinking I was being paranoid. I was laying on my back. Our bed faced our bedroom door. I was on the side of the bed closest to the door. All of a sudden I see a small head peeping from around the door. At first I thought it was my daughter. I said her name. "What are you doing out of bed?" No response, but the little head quickly moved out of my sight. I sat up again, called my daughter's name out, and nothing. My daughter would have came in and said something immediately. I laid back down at this point. I was very scared. I knew for sure what I had seen. I knew I was awake. This wasn't a dream state. My husband was snoring next to me. He was a very heavy sleeper. Then while lying there, the little girl appeared in my doorway. It was not my daughter. No expression on her face. She had shoulder-length brown hair and a dark blue dress with ruffles on it. I freaked. I literally tried to wedge myself under my sleeping husband. In my head, I started praying. I was saying, "Jesus, please be in my house. Please protect us." Next thing I know, as half of me is wedged under sleeping hubby, other half trying desperately to get under him as well, she is at the foot of our bed. Her face no longer expressionless, but instead looked confused or angry or maybe disgruntled. It's hard to explain. Next thing, she took her hands and stretched out her arms and very quickly started pulling the comforter off the bed and onto the floor. I am totally freaking out but can't scream or move. So in my head, I continue praying to Jesus, only I added my deceased father-in-law's name as well. I asked him to help her. I asked him to guide her to wherever she was supposed to go. I asked him to get her to the light, but most important to me at that moment was to get her out of my house. Next thing I know, it's morning. I had fallen asleep, or maybe even passed out from fear. Never had anything happen in that house again, and my daughter never mentioned her friend again either. I like to think that my father-in-law helped her get to where she was supposed to be at, or at least get to peace. After it all, I did some research. A young girl at the age of 5 had drowned in our pond back in the 1970s. Thanks for reading. Story 3. Up to this point in my life, I don't really remember seeing or sensing anything paranormal. So when I was 14, I decided to get a library card for something to do during the summer. I'm an only child, few friends, and just generally would rather stay in and read. I did the usual young teen stories, in particular the ones based on mystery or ghost or some other creepy thing. Lately, I had gotten into the habit of going upstairs to the adult floor. Those dark and shadowy aisles gave me a sense of comfort. I loved how the old books smelled and how the pages had yellowed. Sometimes I felt I was stepping into a time forgotten, surrounded by books that got pushed to the older part of the library when new, current, and fashionable books arrived. For any reason, I loved the older section. One day I happened onto a section of books categorized as paranormal and occult. Interesting, methinks. I checked a couple ghost stories out, went home, and plunged right in. I soon realized I much preferred my parents be home when I was reading. Some scary stuff there for a 14-year-old, know nothing. I devoured all the haunt books in about a month. So just casually, one afternoon, I went to my favorite section to see what I might have missed. No new books, except, wait, here's a new one. Aleister Crowley. So away I went with this book, just thumbing through. I saw some spells and such and was completely intrigued. Back at home, I tore into the book. Actually, I tore through the spells and chants for bringing the dead back to the living, or talking to them or something. I was 14. I wanted to know about this magic stuff. Well, it didn't take long. At night I would wake up and hear what sounded like a room full of people just murmuring on. I couldn't make out one word that was being spoken. I started having a problem going to sleep. I was kind of freaked out, but I kept on reading. Pretty soon my parents were noticing odd happenings. My mom worked very early mornings. She would be the only one up. Her morning routine was that she would bring her day's clothes into the bathroom with her so that after showering they were right there. One particular morning she came around the corner to find pink Kleenex wadded up on top of her clothes, folded on the counter. Nobody was awake but her. Now this is about the craziest part of what happened. Our carpet was a greenish color, sort of a flat carpet. Gradually over time I would notice these half-moon shapes stained into the carpet. They would be in one area, then the next day be somewhere else. We became aware of it in the living room. The dark stains spelled my name. It was weird. At that point my parents asked me to please stop reading those books. I did, but odd things would still happen. I wonder if I conjured some presence by reading out loud the invocations in the Crowley book. There are a lot of other happenings if you would like me to post them. Story 4. Ever since I could remember, I'd always believed in the paranormal. I grew up in a Roman Catholic household, attended 9 years of Catholic school, and up until recently went to church nearly every Sunday. However, my dad had a firm fascination with all things ghostly that go bump in the night, which he passed on to me. Though I'd never experienced anything myself before my experiences as a CNA, there was always this resolute voice at the back of my mind that told me heaven and hell were not the only things behind death's veil, that the dead could linger around if they so very well felt like it. Later on, I would know this voice was right. Fast forward to the summer of 2014, I was a 20-year-old and living in my parents' house for summer break from college. At the time, I wanted to be a physician assistant, so I'd gotten my CNA license to get healthcare experience under my belt. It makes you more competitive in the application process, but I digress. I'd been offered a position on the night shift crew, which my insomniac self accepted in a heartbeat. Little did I know that night shift would be where I would receive my first encounters with the paranormal. Before I jump into my story, I want to give you an idea how the nursing home was laid out. The facility was comprised of independent, assisted, and healthcare living, the last where I worked. The healthcare area itself consisted of 3 halls, which were connected at a hub that was the nurses' station. First hall and third hall faced each other, while second hall was positioned perpendicular between them. Therefore, if you were sitting down hall 1, you could see down hall 3 and vice versa. This particular night had gone pretty routine, no spooky surprises. I'd have several bizarre encounters before this particular incident, but none of them were nearly as noteworthy. It was around 5 in the morning, and we were waiting for shift change at 6. The other CNA I was with was nodding off, so I told her I'd watch out for the nurse. Bad employees, I know, but she was pregnant and I felt bad. We were sitting at the end of the hall 3. She had been dozing for a few minutes when I looked across at the nurse's station and noticed something odd. Now at the time, I knew something wasn't right. Not in a conscious kind of way, but the kind of way that screamed at me, bookmark this, later on you're going to think that it was a trick of the eye or something, but you are seeing what you're seeing right now, so you better look really hard. Across on the other side of the nurse's station, I saw a head bob, then the rest of the body followed. The person looked to be middle-aged, salt and pepper hair regressing, a mustache, and a bright orange polo shirt. At first I thought it was the med delivery guy. I'd seen him at the beginning of the night, so I thought it was odd that he was back, not to mention the med guy's polo was purple, not orange. The man stood straight up and walked into one of the front rooms of the first hall. Wanting to know who it was, I got up and went down to the first hall and looked into the first few rooms. Any of the residents who could actually stand or get themselves up were fast asleep. This figure had most certainly not been the nurse. Needless to say, it gave me chills. I'd never seen anything like it in my life, nor have I since then. Part of me still wants to deny it, explain the incident away, but for now, I guess I can say I finally had an encounter with the other side of the veil. Story 5. My whole family can see spirits. I choose not to, in an attempt to keep my sanity. The encounters that stand out in my mind involves Grandma and my mother. First up is my grandma. She passed on due to cancer. Over the following months I had heard my other family having encounters with her spirit. Mine was a dream encounter. I had dreamt that I had appeared on a beach, which none of my dreams ever had that. I looked behind me and Grandma was walking up to me. We walked along the beach talking. I can't remember what about. The next day I went to my grandpa's for a holiday. I'm at the sink rinsing a cup out when my cousin walks up to me. So, you had a talk with Grandma? How in the hell? I hadn't told anyone. Now, my mom's story. Mom passed on in December 2009. The same cousin who told me she knew about me and Grandma's conversation saw Mom go into the light. I'd heard from family she was still around, but everything started for me about 3 days after she passed on. My mom was a notorious pack rat. Out of boredom, I decided to go through the closet of the apartment and do some cleaning. It was about 9:50 p.m. I know this because Dad usually got off work at 10, so I knew I wouldn't be long until he was home. I threw some papers away and I'm positive I heard Mom call my name. I thought, nah, it couldn't be. The next night, I decided to go to bed around 9:30. I started dozing off when something woke me pretty quick. At the foot of my bed was Mom with a sorrowful expression. She appeared 3 days in a row. One other encounter was with my father's spirit. Dad passed away in November 2014. I got the vibe I wasn't alone at Grandpa's. However, to keep things smooth, I didn't let anyone know. I got your usual cold chills, the feeling of being watched. I was semi-lucky and Dad's second wife gave me Mom and Dad's ashes. However, to keep little hands, children, out of them, Grandpa okayed it to leave them at the house, at his house. They're in his room, where even when I was a kid I wasn't allowed. One day we were doing some work in the house when his fire detector started going off. Thing is, we stopped it and walked away. Grandpa left for the hospital temporarily. It seemed as soon as he left, it started going off again. Every time I'd stop it, it'd start up again 5 seconds later. No doubt as to who was behind it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed. Story 1. I visited Montana for the first time in June of 2004. I would later move there from my home state of Connecticut and live in both eastern and western parts of the state for 9 years. My friend picked me up from Billings Airport and suggested that we see the battlefield. He was a bit of a history buff. When we arrived, we were driving along the road past the visitor center. I got very quiet, suddenly feeling very heavy and serious. We got to a point in the road that looked down some rolling prairie. We decided to get out and walk. My friend, a Montana native, didn't seem to be disturbed very much, but as I looked down into the coulees and saw the white stone markers bunched together closely, I became overwhelmed with terror and deep sadness. I knew that the people who died in that area had been trying to hide and were unable to defend themselves. I could almost see it. I tried telling this to my friend and he seemed perplexed. I started to cry and couldn't stop. It alarmed my friend and he decided we should leave. We left the park and pulled over for a few minutes and I started to calm down. I couldn't explain my experience to someone that had never felt those things, and it was a little embarrassing. It is not the first time, and I'm sure it won't be the last that I encounter an intense residual like that. A word of advice to any empaths or sensitives visiting the battlefield: ground yourself well before entering, or prepare to be overwhelmed with the emotions of these unfortunate souls. Story 2. I served as a volunteer firefighter at the Smith Valley Volunteer Fire Department in Kalispell, Montana, for about 3 years before I moved to Washington, and I have had many encounters there as well as other firefighters, although most of the staff who previously worked there thinks of the afterlife as nonsense due to, and understandably, dealing with death regularly in dismissed mind and a couple other stories. What I myself have experienced and have no other explanation for. I believe the building was built in 2006, and it's right off of Highway 2. As far as I know, it was not built on any Indian burial grounds or anything like that. Many people have come and gone there since it is a very mentally and physically challenging job. You don't ever think of anything being paranormal unless you are alone in the station itself. Incident 1. The first encounter I had was when I had a scheduled shift there and I had baked a frozen pizza in the upstairs kitchen. It was headed to one of the recliners when I heard footsteps on the roof, walking in the same path I was walking. And when I stopped, so did it. I thought maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, so I sat down in the chair and turned on the TV, and the footsteps on the roof started to pace back and forth above me. So I got up, walked over toward the door, stood there listening, and the footsteps walked over toward me and started pacing back and forth above me again. So that was when I first noped right out of the living room, down the stairs, and spent the rest of the day in the computer room in the fire engine bay. Incident 2. It was a week before we were hosting a rummage sale at the fire station, and me and my best friend had brought a washer and dryer set, as well as other miscellaneous things for the sale, into the back of the bay area, when we both heard the loud murmuring of what sounded like some men arguing. But when we started walking towards the stairway of a storage area to where the sound was coming from, you could hear shh, shh, like whoever was up there didn't want us to hear them, and then silence. I went up the stairs to investigate the sounds, and once again I was the only one in the area. Creeped out, I finished unloading the rest of the stuff, and we hopped into my pickup truck and took off after locking up. Even my friend, who didn't at the time believe in anything paranormal, had no explanation for that. Incident 3. I had been telling my roommate, Daniel, name change for privacy, about the happenings at the fire station, and he wanted to go there and experience it too. So feeling brave, I said, screw it, let's go see if we can get anything to happen. Not much did happen as we're walking around the whole building until we got into the kitchen area downstairs. There are 2 kitchen areas, one for the community area and another for the living quarters, and we were downstairs in the community area when we heard stuff moving around, a coughing sound coming from a locked storage closet, and of course, when I unlocked the closet to see what was in there, there was only cleaning supplies and a mop bucket. Neither of us liked that, so we headed to my car to start it up and get warm since it was winter time, and I took a couple extra minutes to lock up the building and turn off all the lights before we left. As I got into the car and I started to back out of the parking space in front of the kitchen area, we both saw the lights in the kitchen turn back on when I knew nobody else but me and him were there, so I tore out of the parking lot and didn't go back until an emergency call a couple days later. Incident 4. After the many things I have had happen here, most small stuff like locked doors opening up, doors that were supposed to be shut opening not on the fire trucks, the above stories, etc., I refused to stay the night there again. But I brought my at the time girlfriend Karen down to the station one evening to give her a tour. A few minutes into walking into the station, one of the extension cords hanging from the ceiling plugged into a truck to keep the truck's batteries charged up popped out of the socket, echoing in the bay. It started swinging back and forth as if somebody had just yanked it out and needed to yank with some force to get those to come out. She yelped and ran over to me, and I said, "All right, time to leave." So we started walking toward the door, and we heard shuffling coming up behind us really fast. So we bolted out the door, locked it, and took off. Of course, I had one more shift to spend there, which goes into my next story. Incident 5. I had brought a buddy from a different fire department onto my department, and since he was now probationary, he had mandatory shifts to work there, and I decided to also work a shift with him one night. This night being the final straw of me staying overnight there again. Ronald and everybody else thought that what I explained to them was nonsense, and that ghosts don't exist. Well, this night changed his perspective of this. I was hanging out in the computer room, and he was upstairs in the living room, when he came downstairs and quietly sat in the chair across from me, with a really puzzled look on his face. I said, "I don't understand. I keep hearing what sounds like boots coming up the stairs, and a shadow of somebody standing at the door, but when I open it up, there's nobody there." Me not wanting to get more freaked out than I already was, I just changed the subject, and we talked about other things to kill some time. Well, it was getting late, and I was tired, so I decided to go upstairs and get ready for bed, and Ronald was going to watch TV and probably fall asleep on the couch in the living room on the other side of the bedroom I was sleeping in. I was in bed going on my phone when the door opened up a little bit, and a shadow of somebody came quietly walking in and walked over toward the window and stood there with his hands behind his back looking out the window. Seeing the TV on through the half-open door, I said, "Ronald, what are you doing? Dude, you're being a creep. Come on, man." No answer. Anyway, annoyed, I got up out of bed while still staring at the shadow. When I turned on the light, and the shadow of a man was no longer there, vanished as soon as I turned on the light. I quickly peeked my head out the door, and Ronald was fast asleep. I spent the rest of the night on the other couch, with all the lights upstairs turned on. I asked him a couple of weeks later if he had any other weird things happen there, and he said one night he was getting ready for bed, and happened to look outside the window before closing the blinds, and he saw two men dressed in suits, standing in the parking lot, standing side by side, looking up at him. He went downstairs quickly to confront the men, and found nobody outside. Checked the security camera the next day, and not a single person was recorded walking through the parking lot. To my knowledge, nobody has died in the building, but we have had a couple of firefighters pass on previously, and their firefighter helmets are hung high up on the wall in honor of them. There are also a few crosses on both sides of the highway in front of the building, so this could also contribute to the activity. Story 3. A little background before I start. I come from a Native American family, and this story takes place when I was 13. I used to like riding my dirt bike out in the hills. I'd usually be out for hours, always returning when the sun started to go down. On this one particular trip, I was cruising along the top of a flat hill in the summer sun. Ahead of me, about 30 or so feet, I saw something shining. As I got closer, I saw it was a medallion-type necklace. It was beaded with metallic parts along the threads. I thought it looked cool, so I took it home. This turned out to be a big mistake. I had the medallion in my dresser, and I didn't bother to tell anyone about it. The night after I found it was when things started to go bad. I was lying in my bed on my side, trying to fall asleep. Then I felt as if someone lied down next to me. I felt whatever it was leaning closer. It started breathing really hard into my ear. I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't want to move nor look at whatever was behind me, so I screamed, and within a few seconds, my dad burst into my room. I was crying, and he was mad that I woke him up. He asked what the hell I was screaming for, and I told him there was somebody in my room. He didn't believe me and told me to get back to bed. I didn't sleep at all that night. Over the next few days, similar things happened, and sometimes I would catch glimpses of something pacing around outside the windows at night. Then on the last day, my grandpa came over to visit while my parents were out. He asked me how things had been, and I told him what's been happening. He put his coffee down and looked me dead in the eyes and said, "What did you do?" Obviously, I was surprised he would suspect me, but then I remembered the medallion. I told him about it and he got pissed. He was yelling and cussing at me, telling me I shouldn't take stuff like that because it didn't belong to me. Just then, a heavy pair of antique handcuffs that were on the wall flew across the room and almost hit me. So I grabbed the medallion, got on my dirt bike, and went back to where I found it. It was difficult, but I was finally able to locate where I had found it. I laid it down, said a prayer, and apologized to whoever owned it, then made my way back home. Things were calmer at the house, so I knew I did something right. My grandpa was still upset with me, but he was glad I put it back. Now I know better than to take someone else's property, whether they're alive or not. Story 4. My story is of a night maybe 3 or 4 days after I messed around with a Ouija board. I know it's not a toy, and I didn't look at it as such, nor did I mess with it like it was. Okay, so here's my story. I should also mention before you read on that this took place in 2007, I believe. So I don't quite remember the date of this night, but I do remember the time like it was just last night. It was about 12 a.m., and I was just getting ready for bed, as I had school the next morning. I owned a bunk bed, and so I climbed to the top bunk. I liked it up there. As I lay there trying to fall asleep, I began thinking of the day's events. I don't remember them now as they were passing thoughts. I glanced at the clock, which read 12:31 a.m., so I closed my eyes to try and fall asleep again, and that's when I heard someone at my door. It was locked, pounding and trying to get in. The doorknob was being rattled as if whoever was on the other side was angry. I heard what sounded like a man's voice on the other side, and I didn't move an inch when it first happened. At first I thought it was my mother, drunk and wanting in, but something inside me told me not to move until it was over, so I stayed frozen as whoever it was tried to get in. After I heard the man's voice, a gruff and growly grunt, I heard a young woman's voice scream in what seemed to be agony or fear. I listened to that scream for about 5 minutes before it stopped. It was done and over with. Nothing after she screamed. It ended. So I got up out of bed, flicked the lights on quickly, and unlocked and opened my door and looked around. At the time, it was 1 in the morning, and no one was awake. The whole house was dark and quiet. It really creeped me out, and I felt really scared, but I'd gone back into my room and fell asleep after a half hour finally. The next day, I'd asked my parents if they were awake, and they heard anything that night. They all told me they weren't awake and that no one heard anything. Story 5. Ever since I was 10, I've noticed weird things that a normal 10-year-old would not notice or see. I was 10 when I first saw my first spirit. I was visiting my grandmother for the summer, my first summer away from my family. It was a couple of weeks, and one night something weird happened. It was about 10:30 when I went to bed. My grandmother went to go to bed, and she always closes my door. I went to sleep in the guest room. Around 11, she went to sleep. About at midnight, I was sleeping and I got a sense I was being watched. I opened my eyes and there was an older gentleman about in his late 70s, and he was wearing a suit like it was 1800s clothing, nothing like what people were wearing. Now this was in 2005 in Astoria, Oregon. I looked at for a few seconds. He was standing in my grandmother's doorway looking down the hall at my grandmother's room. He told me to watch my grandmother. She was in danger. I got scared. Knew it wasn't an evil spirit. It had a calm sense like he knew her, but I got scared. What 10-year-old wouldn't be scared? I hid under my covers for 5 to 10 seconds, and I looked up again. He was gone, and the door was closed, and the presence of someone was gone. I told my grandmother the next morning, and she said that was her grandfather. He always watched out for her, and he was just wondering who was in her house. This was the first time I was visiting her. A couple days later, we were driving to the beach, and she took her medicine right before we left. I was looking out the window when I saw him, the man who visited me a couple nights before, and he pointed down the road. I saw my grandmother sleeping at the wheel, and a huge truck roaring down the highway. I quickly grabbed the wheel and drove away from the truck. I pulled the emergency brake, and we stopped 6 miles from Seaside, Oregon. I woke her up and told her everything. It was so scary. Then in 2006, in Chinook, Montana, I was walking home from school, and I saw this girl hiding behind a tree. I was asking her why she was so shy. She came out, and she had a scar on her face and scratches on her arms. She said her name was Elizabeth. I invited her to my house, not knowing the difference of a ghost and a real person. I asked my mother if I could have a friend over. She said, "Sure, where is she?" I said, "Right here." She told me no one is here. I argued with her, and I went to my room. Elizabeth followed. We were at dinner the same night. My father came home from an accident. He was a police officer, and I told him about my new friend, Elizabeth. He started to cry and told me that a 14-year-old died in the accident named Elizabeth that afternoon, about when I walked home. Now I am 17, and spirits keep following me and watching me, begging me to help them, even though I don't know what they want. Even a demonic spirit named John, and he keeps messing everything up, and he won't leave me alone. I need help. I am terrified of him, and he tells me scary things that are evil and horrifying things that a 17-year-old girl should not hear. He even tells me I'm going to die young. It makes me paranoid to even go out of the house. I have done research, but I need help getting rid of the other spirits and him. I also can sense auras and feel that what other people feel in their souls, and I also know what is wrong with people because I feel their pain. I also have a woman named Kate. She claims to be my mother in a past life and tells me what to do, or she will punish me for being a bad daughter. She also has a little girl following her around named Haley. She is 5 years old, and she always plays little tricks on me or makes things fall. This is my ghost story that no one knows. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed. I would like to take a moment to point out that a majority of my viewers are not subscribed. If you could be so kind as to subscribe, click like, leave a comment, maybe even share the video, it will go a long way in helping me get recommended. And if you would like to join my Patreon, you'll find a link in the description below. For $5 a month, you'll have access to all my content before it goes to YouTube. That goes for stories and my newest edition, short episodes of my mini haunting series. Now, let's get back to the stories. Story 1. When other people tell me their paranormal experiences, I remember one specific night, and I can remember it so clearly. When I was much younger, maybe 5 or 6, I used to sleep with my mother on a king-sized bed. We lived in a small trailer court in Alaska at the time, and we lived a typical life, mundane, uneventful. One night, we were both sleeping in a dark room with no noises or family members around, yet something was going to wake us from our normal routine. I slept on the left side of the bed and my mother on the right side. There wasn't anything special about that day or night that could predict what was about to happen to my mother and I. Out of nowhere, I started rolling towards my mother to the point where I could open my eyes and be face to face with her. After a moment of confusion and not seeing anything in the room with us, my mother simply smiled at me and told me to go back to sleep, and at the time I just did. I didn't think of the fact that it was just me and her there, and what had awoken us from our sleep was footsteps walking between us from the foot of our bed to our heads. I can't think of why that had happened, and it hasn't happened since, but the memory still haunts me. The feeling of the footsteps, one by one, dragging me and my mother to the center of the bed are too real. They weren't light like a cat's light steps. They were large and heavy like a grown man had just ran between us. I don't think my mother slept that night, or got much sleep after that for a while. It was the first experience I had with the paranormal, but not the last. Story 2. The first experience, aged 8. At first it would only run up and down the hallway. It would peek just around my doorway some nights and leave me frozen in fear. I was too stiff to call out for my mother. Eventually it became brazen off my fear and would kneel down in my doorway. There it would sit before its bones cracked out of place. The figure was nearly 8 feet tall, black skin shrouded over bones and nothing to cushion against the creaking ligaments. Wide, far-spread eyes glowed an ominous white. I still remember how it crawled to the side of my bed like some contorted crab. When I shut my eyes tightly, it would be gone before I opened them once more, and it was back at the doorway. They couldn't touch me when my eyes were closed. This could be passed off for a young child's playful mind if it was not for my parents' attention brought to it. My mother and father told me when I was older that I only stopped complaining about the creature when a man began to stand in my hallway. My mother had saw him first. A soft figure in a red old cape and furred clothing with worn leathers. He was obviously Native American and from one of the Alaskan tribes or northern Canada. When he began to appear, the haunting ended in that house. When we moved, they surged at me violently, and I experienced skinwalkers and other beings regularly until I was 13. At 14, an old woman, when I lived in Germany, told me my aura was dark and that several demons had tried to follow me into her house. She had rosaries all over her home. Since then, I've witnessed horrifying sounds, touches, scratching on my bedposts, and other teasing horrors. Nothing really makes them go away unless I go on certain medicines or try my best to ignore everything. I've got autoimmune disorders, severe anxiety, and depression. Could these play into the attraction some dark entities have towards me? I am no longer interested in making it end. I know it won't. I just want to know how to protect myself and learn how to deal with it. Story 3. Things have been going on for a while now, but lately it has definitely increased. It started out this past summer with black shadows appearing before my boyfriend and brother, things moving with no explanation, and hearing walking or a girl's voice talking late at night. My brother on numerous occasions woke up with unexplained scratches on his back, far down the back where he cannot reach to scratch in his sleep. One time we were just talking in the living room and he said, "Ouch." I asked him what was wrong and he took off his shirt and asked, "Are there scratches on my back?" Sure enough, there were, bright red and pink around the skin, so it proved that it had just happened. I had a priest come and bless the house, and it has only gotten worse since then. I'm usually not too frightened and tell it to leave me alone, but because of the past few things that took place within the past couple months, it got me on edge. I have seen this little girl twice. She looks like she might be 6 to 7 years old, always standing by my closet. The first time I saw her, she was in all white and had huge feet, and the second time she was wearing a red dress. The second time I jumped at her screaming, then she disappeared. Last Saturday afternoon, I was laying in my bed watching Netflix with my door open. I can see the bathroom door from my bedroom and saw my brother go from his room into there, shutting the door behind him. A few moments later, I saw a male leave my brother's room wearing a gray hat, black pants, and a jacket, and with a suitcase in hand. I texted my brother, "Who is here?" I knew he was going to jump in the shower, so seeing how he takes forever in there, I stood outside the door and asked to use the bathroom before he jumped in. He opened the door and I asked again, "Who's here with you?" He replied, "No one." I responded by telling him what I had just saw. He said, "I was wondering why you texted me that." We both got goosebumps. 2 nights ago, I was awoken at 2 a.m. with my bed shaking out of control, and every time I would try to fall back asleep, it would shake. I finally turned on the main light and ran into the living room. Since this has all been going on, I cannot sleep without my lamp on. I tried calling my brother who was not home and no answer. Luckily my boyfriend lives next door, so he came over and laid by me until I fell asleep. Then last night, at the exact same time as the previous night, I was awoken with someone yelling, "Hey," repeatedly. I laid there and it stopped. Then I heard a female's voice whispering, what to me sounded like a different language. I then, again, jumped out of bed and turned on every light in the house while I tried to call my brother, who was not there again. He didn't answer, of course, so I called my sister and she answered. I had her wait on the phone with me while I gathered up my things to go sleep at her house. Today I emailed our priest again, who will be coming over again to do another blessing and additional praying on Monday. Also, my co-worker's pastor will be coming tonight to pray over the house. I have talked to a couple of my neighbors, and they said that the same thing has been happening to them, but they didn't want to sound crazy. I am an open person and have seen many things, but nothing this intense, where I am scared to sleep or be in my own home alone. I am religious and have also tried other things like pouring salt around the apartment building and in front of every doorway and burning sage. I even Googled the addresses and nothing came up. But the building was built in the 1970s, so it's pretty old. I've only gotten 3 or 4 hours of sleep per night, and I'm at my wit's end. Does anyone have any ideas how to make these spirits leave? I'm in need of suggestions. Story 4. Years ago I had a friend named Josh. Josh and I had tons of things in common, such as video games, card games, running around outside, and making up stories due to having overactive imaginations. We hung out most weekends and had always had a blast. His mother and father had unfortunately split years before. She was a single mother trying to support herself and her son financially. She would do odd jobs outside of work to bring in extra money. She used to house sit for a family in our church that traveled constantly all over the world, sometimes being gone for weeks at a time. They had a massive house in a very affluent area where I grew up. They were a part of a large stretch of road leading downtown that had these beautiful houses that were built in the 1700s by the people who originally settled in the area. This house was a beautiful dark blue house with a brick fence around the property and large sprawling oak trees every few hundred feet. The property was beautiful and wealthy, and even as a 9-10-year-old boy, I could appreciate its beauty. It was 3 floors tall and had been renovated on the inside with beautiful hardwood floors and no carpet to be seen in any of the rooms. The 3rd floor was a vaulted attic type space but held a living area for the mother of the man who lived there. Unfortunately, his mother had passed earlier that year. Soon after her passing, they started renovations on the 3rd floor, taking out the aging floors that had started to rot and moving all the furniture that was up there out of the house. Remember these details, they are important. There was a very large vaulted library with a TV on the far end of the house, where my friend and I used to play when I stayed over. He would plug in his PlayStation to the TV, and we would play in that room for hours. I hated that room. The tall ceilings had books lined all the way to the top with paintings mounted in a similar fashion. Looking back now, it seems odd that they mounted paintings far above eye level, but who am I to judge their decorating? Anyway, these paintings were antiques, some of which had come with the house originally. No matter what you did, it felt as if their eyes were following you. They were constantly watching and staring. There was a constant, unending feeling of being watched in that room. Even if the lights were off and the only thing that illuminated the room was the TV and the paintings couldn't even be seen, the feeling persisted. The second disturbing thing about that room was that there would be random pockets of cold that seemed to drift around it. You would be sitting on the couch, and all of a sudden there would be a moving cold spot unlike any air conditioning I'd ever felt. This cold was almost chilling down to the soul. It would disturb me every time I felt it, and the feeling of being watched would intensify so much during those moments. We would be sitting in that room playing games and hear footsteps approaching on the wooden floor and expect to see someone walking in. No one did. We brushed it off as hearing his mother walking around in another part of the house, but looking back, I know it wouldn't be her, as these sounded like heavy shoe steps, but his mom didn't wear shoes and really didn't even ever come back to the library to disturb us. We would hear faint knocking on the walls occasionally. There were passages leading through the walls that were designed for the servants to go from different rooms to the kitchen without disturbing the owners of the house. which the current owners used to store random boxes and such. We would hear random clashes and bangs from those corridors, but his mom always had some explanation, saying a box must have toppled over. Looking back now, I remember always being able to see a small amount of fear in her eyes that she tried to hide. One night after playing games for hours, we finally decided to head to bed. On the second floor, there were 4 bedrooms. The layout of the second floor was interesting, with the staircase being cut through the middle of the floors and the rooms surrounding it. Think of it this way, the room made a donut around the staircase that was in the middle of the house and zigzagged through the second and third floors. Anyway, typically we would sleep with the mother in the master bedroom in a sleeping bag, or with her. Give us a break, we were kids. But that night we felt that we were too old and mature to be afraid of the dark. The room we were staying in had 2 twin beds and a couch, and looked like it had at one point been a kid's room. At about 3 a.m., after my friend and I had fallen asleep, I was awoken by a thud. I was groggy and unable to distinguish the sound I had heard and didn't hear it again. Being awake, I realized I had to use the bathroom. The restroom was at the end of the steps that led to the 3rd floor to the right of the master bedroom. I opened our door to the pitch-black hallway. The wood was cold on my feet, and the house felt unseasonably cold for being the middle of July. I moved to the bathroom, looking in at my friend's mother as I passed her room, and she was clearly asleep in her bed. I then went into the bathroom to relieve myself. As I sat there on the toilet, my blood ran cold as I felt a slight breeze cut through me. As I sat there, I heard directly above me 3 distinct steps. Boom, boom, boom. Right above my head. I can still hear the sound now as I write the story, echoing in my brain. It was a distinct sound of boot steps walking on a wooden floor. My mind raced and I knew that there was no one up there. The owners had roped off the 3rd floor stairs so no one could go up there. I sat there trying to explain it in my mind, and then it hit me. They had taken out the hardwood floors in the rooms on the 3rd floor. There were no floors to walk on up there. It was literally impossible for someone to walk around up there, as all that was there were exposed support beams that older houses used to frame the doors. I broke out into a cold sweat as I realized that what I had just heard couldn't have happened. It's a good thing I was on the toilet already. I finished up and sprinted back to our room, glancing in to confirm his mother was still asleep, as she was. I got into the room and, just like the cliche stories you hear, tried to tell my friend what happened, but he was too groggy to hear anything I said. I then proceeded to push the small sofa that was in the room in front of the door, barricading us into the room, as if that would do anything. I crawled back into bed, hiked the covers over my head, and proceeded to not get a wink of sleep. Story 5. This happened to me 5 years ago when I was about 11 years old, living in Fairbanks, Alaska. My family would always rent houses at Birchwood Homes, a decent place to live outside of the Army base my dad worked at. Now, being the kids we were back then, we would always try talking to a ghost to get them to scare us, but nothing ever happened at the moment we were trying them. Now, don't get me wrong, we weren't being mean or smarty about it, just trying to have fun. One day after school at about 4, my mom wanted me to put something up in her room. Now, I never liked going upstairs by myself. Actually, I never liked going anywhere by myself. I would feel like someone was watching me, so I ran up the stairs to try and get it over with as quickly as possible. But as I turned the corner to my mom's room, this shadow-like figure was just standing there at the door. Now, I was totally freaked out. I was so scared I couldn't even move. It was all black with no face, just a hood-like thing, and it was kind of hunched over like when you try to get a dog to come at you. Now, being the expert I was with ghosts, I turned right around and basically jumped down the stairs. With my mom being highly religious at the time, I didn't want to scare her, but she was wondering why I was so scared. So I told her that I had just seen an angel in her room, which she was really happy about. But I knew the truth. What I had seen was no angel. That night I drew what I saw in my diary and only showed it to my sister, for we would always keep secrets for each other. Since then, more things have happened that I can't wait to share, and boy do they get creepier, but this one is where it all really started. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed. Story 1. I have always felt the presence of spirits. They often come to me as a dream-like vision while I'm awake, but almost asleep. In my youth, I got flashes of scary, gory, horrifying imagery. Then I would feel a presence. I learned to communicate with mental imagery and found if I allowed the spirits to pass through me, they could finally rest. It's been many years since I've tried to communicate. In the last 4 or so years, I've had a new experience with visions becoming more than a flash of a dead body or decapitated bloody car wrecks. I started feeling a very heavy negative energy around me at home, like I'm being watched. It's the strongest just before bed. This entity isn't interested in communicating or trying to get my attention to pass on. It feels content to stay and lurk around me in my bedroom. One night, a vision came to me unlike any other. A goat head with horns and a woman's chest with goat legs. After some research, I discovered Baphomet. This was an image I'd seen before, but it scared me so much before I put it out of my mind. Eventually, I performed a sage rubbing, read aloud from my Bible, "The Lord is my shepherd." I lit a white candle, fanned the smoke, and made ash crosses above the doors. I tried imagery of me cutting the head off this beast with a sword. Since, I've gotten a new vision with a 3-horned bull's head man with a man's upper body and lower legs like a hooved animal. Visions of a cliff with gray naked bodies holding onto each other, pulling each other down. I feel worried, scared, and nervous. This entity won't leave me and I'm scared. Any thoughts or advice? Story 2. This is a compilation of small things either I or family have experienced. Each paragraph is its own story. This first one happened when my family went on vacation to the Cherokee Reservation in North Carolina. We've gone many times. It's more like a second home than a vacation spot, so I can't recall what year it was. All I remember is I wasn't a teen yet. We normally stay in a cabin, but this time they were all booked, so we stayed in the Super 8 hotel. It was early morning, and my dad had gone down to the lobby to get breakfast. My mom was laying down watching the news when she heard a man clear his throat, then felt and heard the bed move as if someone was getting up. This next one happened to my big sister. In 2007, one of my dad's friends had just died from a heart attack, and so he went to be with his family for a little while. My sister decided to stay home. She told us when we got back that she had looked outside and saw a figure walking across the field that is by our house, then saw it disappear right before it reached the wood line. Next is something my grandfather told us back in 2009. It was around 2 a.m. when he and my grandmother were jolted awake by the slamming of a door in their house. He got up and grabbed his shotgun to inspect. He checked every door and window in the house, only to find everything as it should be. One night, I was taking out the trash when I looked to my left and saw one of our cats run from the walnut tree to the house, only to disappear halfway. The thing is, that cat had died a year prior. I even saw her run into my parents' room on a different occasion, and my sister and I have heard her distinctive meow once years later. This last one, my mom, dad, and sister have seen multiple times. They describe it as the shadow of a tall man wearing a long coat and a top hat. He's always seen standing outside my parents' room. Just recently, I learned of other people seeing a figure they call the Hat Man. It's seen as being a bad omen, to which I can say every time someone in my family has seen him, a loved one has died a few days later. My mom has seen him twice. The first time her dad died, and then her mom. When my dad saw him, his friend had that massive heart attack. When my sister saw him, our paternal grandfather didn't die, but had a severe stroke. It really gives me chills knowing that this isn't just something my family has seen. Story 3. This one happened one night in 2010. Me, my mom, and older brother, who had recently moved back in because his girlfriend kicked him out, were sitting in the living room. I believe it was somewhere between 10 and 10:30. We had one of the windows open because it was early autumn and the air outside was nice. I was sitting in a chair by the piano looking at the TV, which is in the corner with the window right next to it. This is how I saw the apparition. Anyway, I was watching TV, and suddenly something white and sort of illuminated glides by the window from right to left in the direction of our back door. Thinking it was my mom, I didn't give it much thought until I realized my mom was sitting in the recliner next to me, and my brother was still on the couch. All of this processed within about 2 seconds or so. In realizing this, I jumped up and grabbed the baseball bat we kept next to the door and ran out to investigate. I walked around the entire house, checking high and low, only to find nothing. Keep in mind the area around the window and back door is very open, and in the time of seeing it and going out, there's no way someone could have ran and hid without me at least hearing them. Funny enough, once I go back inside, instantly my brother asked me, "Didn't find nothing, did you?" He said this more matter-of-factly than an actual question. Come to find out, he saw it too, but didn't say anything because at this point, he'd been staying there for about 3 weeks, had seen it twice before, and had did the same thing I did. 2 nights later, around the same time, I was in the kitchen making mac and cheese when I saw it again, only this time it was in the house. Our stove sits right next to the doorway going into the living room, and as I stood there stirring the noodles, I glanced up and saw that same figure go gliding once again from right to left in the direction of the back door. My little sister was curled up in the same chair that I had been in 2 nights prior. I walked in and decided not to say anything about it. I instead asked, "Why'd you just walk to the back door?" She looked at me, eyes wide, and goes, "You saw that too?" Still not letting on that I knew it wasn't her, I simply said, "Stop acting like it wasn't you." She then got upset and promised me that it wasn't her. I asked her what did it look like. She then described the exact same thing I had seen. I know it was mean to accuse her even when I knew it wasn't, but I wanted to be absolutely sure. After talking about it, we both agreed that the figure felt like a woman and meant no harm. Later on, I learned from my brother that when he was living with his girlfriend of the time, they had seen that figure in their home. We believe that it may have followed him when he moved out. Story 4. This story is purely a second-hand account. It happened to my older sister in 2011 while she was home alone. I know it being the events as she tells them and not my own personal experience, one can question its validity even more so, but my sister isn't the type to tell ghost stories, and the way I found out only gives it more truth to me. It happened on a Saturday night. I even know the exact time for a reason you'll see shortly. It starts when me, my little brother, and our dad had gone to a dirt track race at Sumter Speedway. We were there supporting a family friend who was making his dirt track debut in a super late model. My sister had stayed home because racing isn't really her thing. My mom and dad had been going through a tough time, and so my mom wasn't staying with us at the moment. Anyway, we were waiting for the final race of the night to start, the late Model A main, of which our friend had been able to qualify for. The race had to start late because of issues with the clay becoming so dry. As we were waiting for the officials to get the track back to race conditions, my dad's phone rings. It was my sister asking where we were. My dad doesn't really know how to respond. He just says, "We're at the track," in a confused, questioning voice. My sister says, "Y'all need to get home." Dad, "Why? What happened?" Sis, "I just don't want to be here alone." My dad assures her that the last race is about to start, and then we'll be there in about an hour or so. This is when I pull out my phone to see the time, 11:10 p.m. So the race ends, we chat with our friend, and then head home. When we walk inside, my sister has every light in the house on, and is clearly relieved we're there. She then tells me what happened. She was in her room video chatting with her boyfriend when she not only heard her door start to slowly open, but saw the knob turn. It stopped slightly open, then slowly began to open about halfway. My sister called out, "Dad?" Then my name. About 5 seconds after she called out, the door forcefully slammed shut. She jumps up, believing I'm messing with her, only to find we were still gone and she's still there alone. Her boyfriend, who isn't a strong believer, even saw it happen on the webcam. It didn't just end with my sister either. My dad told us that as he walked in, he saw my sister standing in the kitchen, only to have her disappear when he looked fully at her. Some people have asked, well, if she was so scared, then why didn't her boyfriend come over to comfort her? Well, he would have, had he not been living in Wisconsin at the time. We live in South Carolina. On a happier note, our friend placed third that night and went on to place second in season standings. Story 5. This experience happened to me when I was at home by myself. My parents and siblings had gone out of town for the day to visit family and to check on our second property that's about 2 hours away from our home. They wouldn't be back until 11 that night. I was 16, home alone on a Friday night. My mom had bought me snacks, soda, and left me money for pizza. I had a new video game, and Monday was a holiday. Yeah, life was good. At around 7 o'clock, I had just ordered my pizza and was in the kitchen pouring a glass of that wonderful Mountain Dew Code Red. I poured my drink and closed the fridge. As I was walking back to the living room, I heard the sink in the bathroom that is right next to our kitchen turn on. I froze. When I turned to look, I saw that the bathroom light was also on, and against my better judgment, I went to inspect. Upon walking in, I saw both of the faucets, hot and cold, were turned fully on, water pouring into the sink. I wasn't as much scared as I was just confused. Shaking it off, I turned the water and light off and went to the living room to wait for pizza. About 8:30, I was sitting in the living room watching TV and hating my life because I had eaten my entire large pizza in about 11 minutes when I heard a crashing sound come from our computer room. I jumped up, heart racing, and run to look. It turned out that some boxes that were stacked in a corner had fallen and were now strewn across the room. Naturally, I just assumed that they weren't stacked properly and just fell, so I restacked them and went back to watching TV. About 3 minutes later, I hear another crashing sound once more from our computer room. Those damn boxes. So I thought I'd go back, only to find that a stack of CDs that I had sitting at the back of the shelf had been thrown across the room. I guess that ghost didn't much care for Godsmack, Avenged Sevenfold, and Seether. But seriously, this time I got really creeped out. I decided to shut myself in my room with the lights on and wait for my family to get home. But that ghost wasn't done with me yet. For context, my older sister's room was next to mine, so we shared a wall. We've always been close, so it was common for her to knock on the wall with 3 sharp raps to tell me to come see her for something. You may see where this is going. I was laying in my bed, playing my PSP, when suddenly I hear 3 sharp raps on the wall. Not really thinking, I naturally get up to go see what my sister wanted. As I opened the door, it hit me, she wasn't there. But I knew what I heard. It all made sense to me now. She hadn't gone with our parents. She'd stayed home and was messing with me. Her door was shut, so I flung it open to get on her for messing with me. She wasn't there. Logically, I'd assumed that she just left her room and shut the door. The thing is, her door had always had a problem sticking, and as such made a loud noise when open. If she was there, I would have heard the door open and even closed, because it's one of those doors that even when you're trying to quietly shut will make a loud noise. Regardless, I decided to check the entire house. The house is only a 3-bed, 2-bath and was built in 1918, so pretty small by today's standards. I checked every room and closet, even comically looked in the cabinets and washing machine, finding nothing. I go back to my room until I hear my family coming in. First thing my mom asked me was, "How is it being home alone for so long?" I say, "Creepy." Of course, she thinks it was because it was so quiet and I had no one to talk to. I tell her, "No, I mean like weird stuff happening." She says, "What kind of weird stuff?" I say, "Well, the bathroom light and sink turned on by themselves." It shocked me when she got upset and told me to shut up. Her exact words were, don't even say that. It was years ago that stuff was happening, and I sure as hell don't need it to start again." This was one of the most profound experiences I've had in that house, but there are plenty more. Story 6. I was 17 and sitting alone in the living room watching TV. It was about 11:30 at night. Everyone else had already gone to bed. I've always been a night owl, so it wasn't uncommon for me. I had a habit of sitting in the living room with the TV on while I played my PlayStation Portable. Nothing out of the ordinary for me. Having this habit, it wasn't unusual for me to hear or see strange things. I experienced plenty throughout the years. This one just stands out because I find it kind of funny. As I sat there playing my game, out of nowhere a clock radio that my mom had sitting on the fireplace mantel turned on and started skipping through radio stations. Note that this was an analog radio, meaning that you had to physically rotate the tuner to find a station. After about 3 seconds, it turned off. I even hear the click of the switch. I thought it was weird, but whatever, and went back to my game. About 6 seconds after that, it turned on again and once more started cycling through stations. This is where I find it kind of funny because I blurt out, "Would you stop?" And instantly, right after I had said that, the radio switched off and didn't turn on again. And I hear what sounded like someone sit down on the couch by the fireplace. I got the funny mental image of a ghostly person, sad and pouting, plopping down and start twiddling their thumbs. The image made me feel bad, and I actually apologized for sounding mean. I just didn't want my dad waking up and come storming into the living room yelling at me for making all that noise. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed. Story 1. Over the years, I've had many random ghostly occurrences, but what happened with my alarm clock has to be one of the strangest. I have a digital alarm clock / radio. A few years back, I removed the backup battery because it had gone dead. Since then, the clock has worked fine while plugged in. Until a couple weeks ago, when all of a sudden at 3:21 p.m., the clock alarm went off for one beep, then it stopped. Then it went off for about a half minute until I got up to go shut it off. It stopped when I got about a foot away from it. Then it went to the alarm set screen for about 20 seconds, then back to the clock. Normally the alarm going off wouldn't be strange, except that this clock has 2 alarms. Neither were set, and even if they were set, the last times they were set was 5 p.m. and 11 a.m. So there was no reason for it to go off at 3:21. The other weirdness about it is the clock going to the alarm set screen. You have to press and hold the alarm set button for about 10 seconds to get to that screen. And when the alarm is set and goes off, it goes off for about 1 hour before shutting off, not only about 30 seconds. So I went upstairs to tell my dad about it because we have had some ghostly experiences before in our house, and in truth I was a bit freaked out, so I stayed up there for about 5 minutes. When I finally got the courage to go downstairs again, I checked the clock and it was on the normal time screen, but as soon as I started watching the clock, it went again to the alarm set screen again, and then back to normal time. So I watched the clock for about 10 minutes, nothing was happening. Finally I said, "If you're still here, make it go back to the alarm set screen." And within 30 seconds it went back to the alarm set screen. I have asked a few times since then, but since then it hasn't done anything unusual. At first I thought, well, maybe my clock is starting to go out, but seeing as this has not ever happened before, this hasn't happened since, then it seems like it could be a spirit, and the time chosen of 3:21 is my mom's birth date, and she recently died in August. So I'm hoping it is my mom's spirit coming and visiting me. My mom believed in spirits, and we were talking about it one day long before she passed away. I told her, if you ever can contact me from the other side, use the electronics, because knocking things over in a house this chaotic would go unnoticed. Looks like she might have remembered. Story 2. Here are 3 paranormal experiences that I've experienced in the past year. One day, while my little cousins were at my house, we went into the backyard to play. I was enjoying the fall colors when I heard a whisper. It either said, "I'm here," or "over here." It was a man's voice, probably about 20 to 40 years old. When I looked in the direction of the voice, there was nobody there. It most definitely wasn't my uncle's voice, and there were no other adult men there either. I could feel this apparition's voice on my ear. A few days later, I told my cousin Tate, other side of the family, about it. She said that one day when she was playing outside, she heard a man's voice similar to what I heard say, "No." Another sort of paranormal experience was when me and Tate were recording a YouTube video. We were doing one of those slime challenges where I was blindfolded and my cousin had to direct me to the ingredients. While I was pouring in one of the ingredients, I asked, "Is this enough?" and heard a reply, "Add more." That wasn't my cousin, though this voice was probably a younger girl's voice, probably the same age as my cousin. The weirdest part about it was that the voice came up on the video audio. The most recent paranormal experience I had was 2 nights ago. Me and my mom were laying in bed. We had all the windows open because it was very hot in our house. It was late at night, no wind, no rain, not even a breeze, and everything was super quiet when all of a sudden both my mother and I heard this jingling noise. It sounded either like someone's car keys or some bells. My cat started growling when we heard it, so we got up, went to the bathroom, and went back to bed after the jingling stopped. We were thinking maybe it was someone with their car keys, but there wasn't a single sound of doors opening, cars starting, or anything. And we would have heard it because it was so quiet outside. It was especially scary because my cat started growling. He never growls. The only reasonable scenario would be that it was someone's pet that my cat didn't like. But as I said earlier, we didn't hear any door open or close, so there wasn't anyone letting their pet outside. Plus, I didn't hear any footsteps or walking accompanied with the jingling. I came here to ask if the people know of any folklore or mythology that matches with jingling noises, or if anyone else has had similar experiences. The only thing I could find about spirits and ringing sounds was that in different religions, people used bells to get rid of evil. If you know what the heck it was, please let me know. Story 3. I've experienced many unexplainable things, but this is one that has stayed with me. In a scenic Minnesota city, near where I went to college, there is a theater that is storied to be haunted by a mischievous ghost. This ghost, or the Blue Man, was known to move props, mess with curtains, and turn the stage lights on and off during performances. Stage managers would talk about things going wrong in the booth, and then suddenly fixing themselves. Actors would talk about weird feelings or shadows backstage, and several people that I knew had reported to have seen a man in blue coveralls, shaggy light hair, and 70s style glasses around the theater. The theater was attached to an old train depot, so it stands to reason that the ghost was a worker or engineer, but I do not know that to have ever been confirmed. Being an actor and a paranormal believer, I loved hearing stories of this supposedly haunted theater. No one ever felt threatened or that anything evil was there. If anything, stage managers and crew would be annoyed because inevitably, during every production, something would be amiss. I only worked there twice, both times in musicals. The first show, I played a lead and would come in early years and was often the last person to be dismissed from rehearsal. I tend to be pretty sensitive to paranormal things and was aware of that feeling of being watched or that uneasy feeling of not being alone but not being able to place why. I was pretty consumed with rehearsals though and didn't spend time thinking about ghosts or the Blue Man until he came to rehearsal one night. To paint a better picture of the theater itself, it's a proscenium stage, one of those big places with fly space and wing space. A stage about 3 feet from the floor where the audience sits. The house itself has few hundred seats, all in a slight semicircle facing the stage. The lighting booth was dead center in the back. It's important to note that there are center aisles. Audiences would enter from the lobby through the double doors and then could go left or right through a swinging door that was propped open before the show and at intermission, but then closed during the performance by ushers, and would have get their seats from either of the 2 aisles. This means that if your seat was in the middle, you had quite a number of seats to walk by to get there. Each row had between 20 or 30 seats or so. The 2 swinging doors at the exits were very heavy and would bang loudly if you didn't catch them or close them carefully. To minimize disturbance and interruptions during rehearsals, the stage left door was always bolted shut. So basically the only way into the theater from the audience was the door on the stage right. The only door into the lighting booth was also on stage right. Alright, so one night, per the norm, I was the only actor left and was working on stage with the director and assistant director. Everyone else had left either through the back door, loading dock, or through the stage right door to the lobby. We had been working for a good 45 minutes and were the only 3 people left in the building. I was standing on stage, toward the edge of the stage. The director and AD were on the floor in the audience in front of me, comparing notes in the script that was lying on the edge of the stage. We were all leaning over it. The 2 of them were discussing something, and I suddenly got this overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I looked up, and there he was. In the very back row, far left corner of the audience, was a man with shaggy hair and 70s style glasses. It looked like he was wearing a gray button down to me, and I only saw him from mid-chest up, like he was either sitting in that corner seat or standing behind it. I did a bit of a double take because I wasn't expecting anyone else to be there and hadn't seen or heard anyone come in. I was on stage and had been performing straight out to the audience and would have seen if anyone came in. I thought, oh, it must be a janitor or the parent of one of the kids in the show, so I went back to looking at the script. The director and AD didn't seem to notice him and were still talking, so I straightened up and looked back at the guy in the back of the house. We had eye contact. He was looking right at me. I smiled at him and did a little half wave at him. He didn't respond but kept looking at me. I looked down at the script and in a split second thought, wait, no one else is here, and immediately looked up again, and he was gone. I was stunned, literally frozen, staring at where he had been. It was only then that I remembered the description of the blue man and thought, oh my God, that must have been him. The director and AD asked me something and brought my attention back to them. I asked if everyone else had gone, and they said yes, and that we had to exit out of the back because the janitor had locked everything in the front when he left 45 minutes earlier. Neither of them saw anyone else or seemed to feel anything or to even notice that I was a bit shook up. We packed up our stuff, and I watched as the AD walked to the stage left door in the audience and pulled on it. It was locked. He walked all the way across the back row of seats to the stage right door, pulled on it to make sure it was locked, and then we turned off the light, exited through the loading dock together. When I got to my car, my heart started racing faster as I tried to reasonably explain what I had seen. It could have been a janitor. It didn't look like the janitor, but it could have been one I hadn't met yet. But if it was, I would have seen him leave. I had looked away from him for no more than a second, and the man was gone. How could he have gotten out? The only door that was open during rehearsals was stage right, and I would have seen him walking across the back row, just like the AD had done to go check the doors. He could not have gone into the lighting booth because that entrance was also on the right. If he had keys, he would have had to either unlock it before he left or lock it after he left, and that would have taken time, and all 3 of us would have heard that deadbolt turn. He would have had to stand and open that swinging door, which I would have seen, and if he left in a hurry, he would have had to let the door close on its own, or I would have seen it closed, but there was no loud door slam. The more I thought, the more convinced I was that I had seen the blue man. My first time seeing an apparition, it was kind of a big deal, but then I started to worry. He liked to mess around with things like curtains and cables and lights in the wing space and fly space during shows. And this particular show involved actual flying with cables and harnesses. I was suddenly worried that one of his pranks could affect the rigging and someone, like me or children, could get hurt. The next night I got to rehearsal early. No one else was on the stage. The ghost light was still there, and I walked down stage center to where I had been standing when I saw him. I felt like someone was watching me, and my chest felt tight, and I was excited and nervous as I looked out into the house, all around the stage and up in the rafters. I said something to the effect of, "Hello, and I said my name, and I'm playing," and I said the role I was playing. "Thank you for coming to rehearsal last night. It's nice to meet you. We're all very excited for the show, but I'm really nervous about flying and all the harnesses and cables. Would you mind keeping an eye on us and keeping us safe?" And then I thanked him again for coming to rehearsals and for sharing the space with us. I didn't see him again after that. I sometimes felt things backstage, but for the most part, paranormally speaking, things were quiet the rest of the rehearsals. People even commented on how they hadn't seen or heard from the blue man yet. We got through all the rehearsals and all the performances without a single problem with props or lights or sound or cables, Well, that couldn't be obviously explained by human error. At the cast party, the stage manager and I were talking, and she said it was the first show she had ever done where the Blue Man didn't do anything, and she had been doing shows there for years. When I told her about what I experienced, she smiled and nodded her head and said, "Well, must have made a friend." I don't know if that's true, but I'm very glad to have had that interaction. I think because I said hello that first night and asked him nicely to keep us safe, that we had some kind of understanding, at least for that show. The very next musical I was also in. I didn't see him or even feel his presence during rehearsals, but then one night during the first huge company number, the stage lights suddenly all went out. The actors and musicians kept going, and a minute or so later the lights all suddenly came back on. The show must go on, and no one missed a beat, but at intermission I found the stage manager, who was in the booth controlling the lights, and asked her what happened. She sort of laughed and said, "I guess he's back at it." Story 4. Shortly after turning in for the night, dog sleeping by the nightstand, I go through my email and check my online buying and selling sales. While doing so, the increased depth and volume of breathing from the dog got my attention. It was unusual, but I continued my business. A few minutes later, again, I heard the breathing. It was getting louder, or closer, or both. Now it has my undivided attention. Why? Because I was hearing 3 breathing. Me, the dog, and something else. The room is dark except for the light of my phone. The 3rd breathing I hear is at the foot of my bed. It's a normal breathing rate, not heavy, not deep. I look to the nightstand and my dog is sound asleep. Now I ask myself if I'm dreaming or if this is really happening, so I pinch, slap, and punch myself. I'm not dreaming. So I hold my breath and count the numbers breathing again. I hear 2. There should only be the dog breathing. I do it a second time with the same results. All the while, whatever this is, it's going around the side of the bed, moving up the side, getting closer. I look to the nightstand again to be sure it's not the dog. He's still sleeping. Again, I pinch, slap, and punch myself. It's not a dream. Now I start talking to this anomaly or entity, whatever it is, under my breath. I tell it to shut up. The breathing continues. Talking to something you can't see or feel, yet sounds like a person. Under my breath, I tell it to shut up again. It continues. Try to imagine it. Now it is standing at the side of my bed. I reach to feel if something is there. Nothing. I can't see it or feel it. My mind is racing. I tell it to shut up. Speaking louder, I'm asking myself, what more can I do? I repeat, speaking even louder. Shut up. Still nothing. Now the breathing is 12 inches from my ear. I can't see or feel it. Now I tell it to shut up the last time, this time adding profanity. Well, it finally stopped. What was it? Well, prior to this, there were things happening, such things as doors closing, faucets turning on, cameras being bumped during filming, and an astronomical number of orbs in the living room, most coming out or going into the fireplace flue. Some have said the townhouse to be a portal. The most interesting are 5 phenomenons. 1, my granddaughter communicated with the spirit of a little girl. 2, my ex-wife's grandmother was trying to communicate with me. 3, the central air was turned off on one of the hottest summer days. 4, the dog was growling and barking at something I couldn't see. And 5, a black mass that I saw. I don't know whose or what spirit was next to me that night, or what would have happened if I hadn't told it to shut up. Nothing happened after that I'm aware of. I do know it was a phenomenal experience. I had incidents at the apartment I just moved out of too. That's a whole different story. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed. Story 1. My husband Alan and I bought an old house outside of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. We had to beg, borrow, and nearly steal enough money to buy the property and hire the contractors to get the house habitable. We knew nothing of the history of the house, other than the fact it hadn't been lived in since the early 1900s. The house was 2-story and had obviously experienced major renovation. The front of the house was older and a completely different architectural style than the rear. There was no animal life on the property. It was 5 acres, 14 miles northeast of Murfreesboro. This part of Tennessee is lousy with all manner of wildlife, coyotes, raccoons, possums, and deer in particular. There was a constant stream across the back of the property with easy access. There was no reason why we shouldn't have seen animals on a regular basis. There weren't even tracks at the stream. We didn't even have birds on the property. The team working for the contractor reported they constantly felt like they were being watched. As time wore on, the workers began to complain their tools were coming up missing, only to be found later, always inside the house. Through all of this, we had never gotten upstairs to the second story. There was one stairwell behind a very heavy wooden door. Try as we might, we couldn't get the door open. The only thing we could do would be to ruin the door by taking it off the hinges. For some reason, this was unacceptable to me. A friend of ours, Scott, who was helping us with the work we could do ourselves and save on repair costs, climbed a ladder and looked down through the window in the stairwell. He saw a couch and several rolls of carpet leaned against the door, blocking it. When the workers were done with the main floor, Alan, Scott, and I were to finish off the remaining work. This was mainly painting the walls and baseboards. We were almost done. Alan and Scott left to go to the hardware store and to get dinner for the three of us. They would be gone for about 2 hours. I had the last baseboard left, then planned on taking a well-earned hot bath before the guys got back home. I wrapped up my work, went to the bath, and ran the water for my bath. The last thing I remembered was sitting on the bed and lying back for a moment. The next thing I remember, Alan was waking me up. I guess I had been sound asleep. I vaguely remembered running the water for my bath. Alan mentioned something about the water still being hot, so I must have just run the bath. This sort of confused me because I'd started the bath well over an hour before. The water should have been cold by then. I didn't even remember turning the water off. I shook off the sense of confusion because I was struggling so much to try to wake up. I sat down at the table with the guys. They'd grabbed KFC for the three of us. I realized then I still had my gloves on from painting the baseboards. I slipped the gloves off, not even bothering to wash my hands. I remember being famished. I was starving and felt, for lack of a better description, drunk. I just loaded my plate and dinner when something caught my eye. My wedding rings were missing. I can count on one hand the number of times I'd ever taken my rings off. They're not anything special, nothing gaudy. It's just that they're my wedding rings. I rarely wear much in the way of jewelry. It's just not my style. The sentimental attachment I have for them is so important to me, and they were gone. At first I thought Alan and Scott were playing a joke on me. For minutes I believed they were pranking me. When they finally convinced me that they had nothing to do with it, we began searching the house. The three of us spent over an hour tearing up the first floor trying to find them. We had no luck. I spent the next several weeks constantly on the lookout for my rings with no success. Alan only once mentioned buying me a new set. Aside from the fact that we didn't really have the money for it, I refused to give up on finding my rings. All during this time, I began to feel a constant presence in the house. Alan said he never felt anything. Scott, our friend, who is very attuned spiritually, said he also sensed a presence, but only briefly, then it would go away. After a couple of months, Alan and I finally managed to build our nest egg back up to begin working on the upstairs. I still insisted that we not damage the door, so Scott and Alan went back up the ladder, slipped in through the window in the stairwell, and dropped in. The two of them moved the couch and carpet rolls aside, allowing us to open the door. Scott's wife, Alex, was there with me, helping me open the door. The four of us went up the stairs and began exploring the second floor. We had to be careful as much of the flooring was rotted. We each sort of went our own way. The rooms were covered in dust, dirt, and cobwebs. What light there was came in as sunlight through the windows. After a few minutes, I heard Scott call for us. The room he was exploring down the hall, around the bend, and at the other end of another hallway, he was standing in front of a bureau, basically a fancy desk with several small drawers. One of the drawers had been pulled open. He looked at me and told me to look inside. My wedding rings were in the drawer, sitting on top of a dingy old journal wrapped in a ribbon that was probably the color red a long time ago. I accused him of doing this, again saying he was pranking me. Alan and Scott's wife, Alice, finally convinced me Scott would never do such a thing, but what other explanation could there be? The workers we hired to repair the upstairs reported the same sort of instances and previous workers had. They claimed to feel like someone was always watching them. Tools would come up missing, but always be found on the main floor. For his part, Alan began to get impatient with all of this going on. He insisted there was nothing going on except overwrought imagination. Even when the work was done, Alan was feeling more and more upset on the subject. By then, I had a constant sense someone was watching me. If I brought the subject up, Alan would get angry with me. Our entire life savings was tied up in the house. I was the one that wanted the house at the outset more than him. Now that we had it, I was the one who was constantly complaining. I got to the point I wouldn't even bring the subject up to him anymore. For the next year plus, I began to feel more and more alone and isolated. I wasn't getting enough sleep anymore. It would nap off during the day. When I would nap, I would have intense dreams that I wouldn't remember when I awoke. The only thing I could recall was that someone or something was touching me. Over time, these feelings became more and more intense. I would awake from one of these naps and find my clothes had been moved, altered. Since I worked from home, I could dress casually, usually jeans and a t-shirt. When I would wake up from one of these intense dreams, I would find my t-shirt lifted to my shoulders and my jeans opened. Sometimes my underwear were pulled down with my jeans. My energy level was at a constant low ebb. I couldn't talk to my own husband about any of this. I was spending my days just going through the motions. The dividing line was the night I'm convinced I was molested by whatever was in the house. It was night. Alan and I were in bed. He was sound asleep. I was watching TV, basically zoned out and barely aware of whatever show I was watching. I heard footsteps coming down the hallway. I was accustomed to this. I was so worn down by all this it no longer bothered me anymore. The footsteps stopped at the door, like they always did. As always, I expected to hear the footsteps walk away, as though someone was walking away from the door. That didn't happen this time. The door to our bedroom began to slowly open. I heard steps entering our bedroom and stop by the bed. This time, because this had never happened before, I was focused wide-eyed at the space by my bed. I was suddenly frightened. This had never, ever happened before. I reached over to shake Alan to wake him up. He didn't budge. He was out cold. I whispered his name, begging him to wake up and help me. He wasn't snoring. He just wouldn't wake up. The sound I heard was something between a growl and a chuckle. I wasn't alone, and whatever it was laughing at me. The covers slowly slid down my body and off the bed. Alan still didn't wake up. I wear sweats and a tank top to bed. I felt a hand tugging at my sweatpants, pulling them down. I punched Alan, yelling at him to wake up. Nothing happened. I tried to roll off the bed to get up, to get away. I felt a hand at my throat, slamming me against the headboard. My sweatpants were pulled off, and something grabbed my left ankle and pulled me down, forcing me onto my back on the bed. Whatever assaulted me marked me up. The pain of the attack was nothing like I'd ever experienced before in my life. It wouldn't stop. I felt a clawed hand at my throat, holding me in place. The other hand alternated between squeezing me in different places, raking its claws over my stomach, and occasionally playing with my wedding rings, twirling them around my finger. At one point I felt it tugging at them. I passed out at some point during this. The pain was that bad. When I woke up, I was laying naked on the bed. Some oily substance covered me from my inner thighs to my crotch. I had scratches on my face, hands, fingers, legs, chest, shoulders, and over my stomach. My legs were draped over the edge of the bed, nearly touching the floor. Alan was still sound asleep. We had several guns in the house for home defense. I'm not saying I was thinking remotely clearly, but I grabbed my 9mm from my nightstand and ran to the office nook of the den. I can't tell you why, but I felt safe there. I guess because nothing ever happened to me when I was there. I finally dropped off to sleep. Alan woke me up when he was leaving for work. All he could say to me was to ask why I tore the bed up. I literally sat there just blinking at him. During the day, whenever I felt at all that something might be happening, I would run to my office nook, even when I didn't feel like something was going on. I stayed in the nook all I could. The longest time I was away from my safe place was when I showered. I kept scrubbing myself, scouring my inner thighs and crotch. Even when I'd washed away the goo, I could still feel it. When it was time for Alan to come home, I ran out of the house and waited for him by the driveway. We were going to have a talk about what happened to me. I hadn't imagined it. It wasn't a bad dream or a nightmare. It wasn't some messed up wet dream. Someone or something was in the house and it had molested me. I needed my husband to believe me and to help me. He blew me off and told me it was my imagination. I asked him to explain the scratches on my body, going so far as to jerk my t-shirt up to show them to him. He said they were self-inflicted. When I grabbed his arm and demanded he pay attention to me, he wheeled and glared at me in a way he'd never done before. Like all married couples, we'd had our arguments. They'd never gotten physical, but Alan had a temper, and I knew what it looked like. This was exponentially worse. I swear he looked at me like he was ready to kill me. All he would say was that I needed to get over whatever horny dream I was having, and leave him the hell alone. He yanked his arm away from me and marched into the house. I had never felt so alone and abandoned in my life. Nothing happened for the next several nights. On the sixth night after my molestation, I heard the footsteps again. I grabbed my pistol, knowing full well it was useless, but I grabbed it anyway, and ran to the nook. I could still hear the footsteps, but nothing happened. The same thing happened the next night, and again. I ran to the nook. If it's possible to sense frustration and anger, it was virtually palatable. Whatever this was angry with me. Nothing happened the eighth night after my attack. Alan had gotten into the habit of not even waking me up when he left, whether I was in bed or in the nook. I had a bunch of errands to run that day, so I woke up with Alan already gone. I was so pissed that he was ignoring me, and it was very much affecting our marriage. Our plan was always to get to the house, save up our money, and then start our family. I could still work from home even with a baby, so things should have been going according to schedule. Problem was, Alan and I weren't having sex at all. That had been an issue before. We were always so active when we were dating, and then when we first got married. Since we moved to the house, the frequency was getting less and less. By the point of my attack, it had been months since we'd been interested. I got in the shower and started scheduling my daily itinerary. I never heard the footsteps. I never knew the danger I was in until it was too late. The shower curtain jerked aside. Before I knew what was happening, I felt a clawed hand at my throat, slamming me against the shower wall. I hit the wall so hard it knocked my breath out. The clawed hands pinned my wrists above my head. I was molested a second time. The pain was just as bad, but this time I wasn't lucky enough to pass out. That's how I looked at it anyway. The difference this time was I smelled its breath, or what I assumed was its breath. It was so awful. I can only describe it as noxious. It made no sound while it was assaulting me, but again it played with my wedding rings. There was no sound until it was done. I collapsed into the tub when it was done and let me drop. I swear I could hear it laughing. When I could collect myself, I barely took the time to get dressed and fled the house. When I felt like I was far enough away from the house to be safe, I pulled over and started crying. I couldn't stop. Some people took mercy on me, came over to me, see if I was okay. I just told him I was fine. I couldn't talk to Alan because he didn't believe me or seem to care. I'd been progressively cut off from my friends, but desperately needed someone to talk to. With no other option, I called Alex at work. She left work to come to basically rescue me. That's what it felt like anyway. We met at a park where we would talk without being interrupted. I told her everything. I left nothing out. I suddenly realized just how crazy my story sounded. I felt like an idiot. Alex was just the best. She didn't interrupt, had plenty of tissues ready for me, and just listened. When I was done, she said we were going back to the house just long enough for me to collect a few things, and she was taking me to her house. I dreaded walking back into the house. Even Alex said she'd never felt so much anger and aggression. I was there long enough to throw some things in a bag and we left. Alex wouldn't leave me alone for even a moment. We didn't talk, didn't say one word. I called Alan from my cell phone after we left. I told him what I was doing, where I was going, and why. He had a fit. He yelled and screamed so loud Alex could hear him quite clearly. I was embarrassing him. I was having a nervous breakdown. When he was done yelling at me, he hung up on me. I cried for the rest of the night. Unbeknownst to me, Alan called Scott and yelled at him because Alex, Scott's wife, was interfering in his marriage. Bless his heart, Scott knew nothing about it and took a verbal chewing for me. Alex insisted I tell Scott everything when we finally got home. Scott was just as patient with me as Alex had been. When I was done, Scott said I wasn't going to go back to the house until he checked it out. Alan could just get over his damn self, per Scott. This was Alan's friend. First thing first, Scott began to dig into the history of the property. He wasn't going back to the house until he had some sense of what he was walking into. When he was done with that, Scott went to the house, but didn't go in. He was there for Alan. My husband put up a massive fuss, but Scott finally convinced him to stay with him and Alex, just for a couple of nights. It was the weekend, so work wasn't going to be a problem. Alan changed almost immediately. The first night at Scott and Alex's house, he easily slept for 10 hours. I probably slept longer. When he woke up, he acted like he just had his first real night's sleep in months. It took a couple of days, but Alan and I started talking. Alan wasn't still sure what to believe, but at least he was listening to me. I was crying a lot around this time. It just felt like such a weight was being taken off my shoulders. Then Scott finally wrapped up his investigation into the property's history. Briefly, the original house had been built in 1850, about 11 years before the Civil War. Murfreesboro was the site of a major Civil War battle, the Battle of Stones River. Just prior to the battle, there had been smaller skirmishes. It was during one of these skirmishes that 4 Union soldiers deserted their unit. They came upon a family to the south and west of Nashville. They molested the owner's wife and killed the family. Their unit commander discovered what they'd done and immediately placed them under arrest. With Stones River upcoming, it wasn't time to have a court-martial just yet. Instead, the company commander ordered one of his officers and 2 enlisted men to escort the prisoners back to Nashville. When the weather turned ugly, the officer came upon the house, our house. He arranged with the owner to keep the prisoners in the barn, and they would wait out the winter storm. The weather kept up, so the officer sent one of his men to Nashville to notify Corps Command where they were and why they were there. The next day, area residents reported the house, our house, as well as the barn, was burned down. The family and all the Union soldiers were dead. The Union closed the case, and all involved were dead. Scott speculated that any number of things could have occurred. The prisoners got loose, killed their captors, attacked the family, and burned the house down. There was something to this, as all 4 prisoners were found inside the house, not the barn. The officer and the other guard were found in the barn, also burned to death. The owner, known to be friendly to the Confederacy, killed the officer and guard, and the prisoners got loose. Unlikely, but possible. Local citizens, also friendly to the Confederate cause, attacked the house and killed everyone in an effort to kill the Union soldiers. Scott knew an empath, Lay, who was willing to do an on-site investigation with him 2 weeks later. If I have to mention it, we were still staying with Scott and Alex. What Scott and Lay were able to deduce was even worse than he'd speculated. There were only 2 spirits in the house, Anna Rose Hastings, the wife of the owner, and her only child, her son Hiram. Hiram had virtual free run of the house and attacked Lay several times. Per Lay, Hiram was afraid of Scott and cursed her whenever Scott was interfering with him. Anna Rose, Hiram's mother, was chiefly located in my office nook. Hiram was the spirit who attacked me. His mother, Anna Rose, protected me whenever she could. Hiram was so much more powerful than his mother. Anna Rose finally relented and told Lay what happened. Hiram had been hanging out with the prisoners. He was 16 years old at the time. Somehow, Anna Rose wasn't sure. Hiram freed them and helped them kill their captors. Hiram was going to run away with the prisoners. They wanted to go into the house to finish waiting out the storm, grab enough supplies for their journey, then they'd leave. Hiram's father, Cyrus, got into a fight with the prisoners. He killed 2 of them. Cyrus grabbed his belt and began beating Hiram for his actions. The other 2 prisoners turned on Cyrus and killed him as well. Anna Rose sobbed as she told Leigh that not only did the 2 Union soldiers molest her, but Hiram did as well. He killed his mother when he was done with her. Then the prisoners turned on Hiram, knocking him unconscious and setting the house and barn on fire. Somehow the fire spread too quickly and the Union soldiers were caught in the fire and perished. Per Anna Rose, the house sat empty for a long time. Only she and Hiram wandered the property. She gave the name Jenkins, no first names, as the next residence. Scott's research indicated the Jenkins family bought and renovated the house in 1879. Spiritualism was popular at the time, and the Jenkins family and friends began invoking spirits, reaching out to the netherworld for contact. This turned Hiram loose once and for all. Anna Rose said Hiram assaulted Mrs. Jenkins and her 15-year-old daughter. The family abandoned the property in 1895. The county seized it back for taxes and it sat empty until 1909. That's when Javier Colonisa bought the property. He tried to renovate it again and wanted to make it a hotel. The effort failed and Colonisa abandoned the property 14 months later. We were the next official residents. Unofficially, both Scott and Leigh discovered that in 1975, teens began hanging out there. Satanism was popular among teens, and these were no different. They began holding seances, invoking demonic rites, and holding satanic rituals. Anna Rose claimed it was all she could do to keep the property safe from the demonic presence. Hiram was working to invite demons to aid him. Anna Rose blamed herself for what happened to me. She was so afraid of her son and the damage was done. Scott has worked with 3 teams that have cleared properties of poltergeist and demonic possession. They have had mixed success. He got nowhere trying to get Hiram to leave peacefully or otherwise. When he made this attempt, it was only time Hiram actively engaged with Scott. Seems like it was more out of fear and defense than anything else. Alan had finally had enough. He ultimately agreed to sell the house. We basically lost our savings and were wiped out as we still had bills to pay to a couple of contractors. Our marriage suffered and it's still not the same, and at this point it never will be. We never got around to having kids, largely because I had no interest in having a physical relationship with Alan. We have even gone as far as separating twice and discussed divorce. We always got back together, but were almost more like friends than husband and wife. The guy who bought the house knows the history. Tennessee has some interesting laws. Among them, if you have reason to believe your property might be haunted, you have to disclose it. The buyer actually seemed to like the idea. He had no wife or family, so there's that. I have no idea if he's had issues with the house or not. Alan and I occasionally check to see if the house has been sold or abandoned again. The buyer is still there, apparently. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed.